Sometimes a comeback is expected, sometimes it's a surprise. But more often than not, there will be a logic behind why a certain individual chooses to return at a certain point in time. Maybe it's the case of Triple H returning from an injury in 2002. Maybe it's CM Punk deciding to start a second career in the ring in 2021. Either way, each of these could have been predicted by many fans. But what happens when a return is so random there seems to be no rhyme or reason behind it? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today. So join us today as we take a deep dive into some of the most bizarre comebacks of them all in Random Returns, WWE's most obscure comebacks. And if we're gonna start somewhere, let's go all the way back to the Attitude Era, as it was there that, right when the likes of Steve Austin and The Rock were rising to the level of mainstream superstars, WWF would make the curious decision to bring back a star from the 80s no one was asking for, and that was George the Animal Steele. Sure, Steele may have been a popular performer during his initial run with the company in the 70s and 80s on account of his savage wildman character, but by the time the late 90s had come around, it seemed like his act was a thing of the past. That was why it was so surprising then that, on the December 29, 1997 episode of Raw, he appeared as a tag team partner for Taka Michinoku during a tag match against Brian Christopher and Jerry Lawler. Of course, his presence here immediately stuck out like a sore thumb, as it made little sense for him and Michinoku to be aligned. So maybe that was why, in the months which followed, the Animal would be given a more fitting role when he was made a member of the Oddities, with him getting to share the ring here with other freakish characters such as Giant Silva, Luna Vachon, the Insane Clown Posse, and masked figure Golga. And when it comes to the man behind that mask, like George Steele, he would have had a prior career himself in WWF during the 80s. Though he was never a turnbuckle-chewing animal. No, he was Earthquake. But after his run with the Oddities ran its course in early 1999, he would disappear for a couple of years again, with him never to be seen after that until the point he showed up for the Gimmick Battle Royal at WrestleMania 17. Once back though, there would be some early discussions given towards the idea of him returning to his old gimmick. After all, if it had worked so well before, what's to say it couldn't work again? Well, the reality here was that John Tenta was a decade older by then, and so, with him having lost a step or two, combined with the fact that he'd cut a lot of weight in the intervening years and no longer had the gigantic figure required to play the role, things would be quietly dropped after the big man appeared in one dark match on a SmackDown taping soon after this. But when it came to another figure that had made a splash around about the time of Earthquake's return, well, quiet seemingly wasn't a word in his vocabulary. So when he returned in 2011 to Absolute Crickets then, it must have been a shock to his system. Who are we talking about? Grandmaster Sexay, of course. Yes, in the late 90s and early 2000s, Too Cool were one of the most popular acts on the WWF roster. And a big part of the reason for this, of course, was that with Grandmaster Sexay and Scotty 2 Hotty having Rikishi by their side, they were quickly able to dance their way from the lower mid-card right into the main event scene. But for as much as these dance breaks might have been a hit with fans, by June of 2001, Brian Christopher would end up getting released from the company as a consequence of his various drug issues. Still, as the son of Jerry the King Lawler, it felt inevitable that he would return eventually. It was just that no one expected it to happen the way it did. And how did it happen? Well, by 2011, Lawler was involved in a feud with his broadcast partner Michael Cole, with Cole playing the heel here and continually trying to get under the King's skin. So on the March 14th episode of Raw that year then, he would announce he'd convinced Grandmaster Sexay to return to WWE so as to verbally trash his father and embarrass him on live TV. The only problem with this one is that it was Christopher who ended up coming out looking the most embarrassed here, as, when his music hit, rather than getting a big return pop, you could have heard a pin drop for how silent it was. Seriously, the whole thing is so eerily and hilariously quiet, it's almost as if it's a rib being played on the former Too Cool star. Needless to say then, with this comeback flopping hard, Grandmaster Sexay would not become a regular figure on WWE TV once more. No, instead, he would fade back into the ether, only showing up again for another one-time appearance a few years later. To find an example of a more successful, albeit equally as random return around this time period then, we'd have to jump forward to 2013, because it was there that Rob Van Dam surprised everyone when he was announced as a participant in that year's Money in the Bank ladder match. Of course, RVD had been a big star in the wrestling world in the years prior to this. After all, He'd first been able to hit it big during the 90s in Extreme Championship Wrestling, all before he then took that star power and successfully translated it over to WWE at the turn of the millennium. Still, by 2013, with him having been gone from the company for the last 6 years, few people expected Mr. Monday Night to make a return to Vince McMahon's promotion anytime soon. Not that it wasn't welcomed when it happened, of course, because with fans quickly getting behind him as usual, RVD was able to put on a good showing in the aforementioned Money in the Bank ladder match, with him following this up by serving as a great utility player in the months after, getting to have one-on-one encounters against the likes of Chris Jericho, Dean Ambrose, and Alberto Del Rio. That said, he felt very much just like another body on the roster here and not the star he'd once been, making it a little confusing as to why the company chose to bring him back at all. And of course, he wasn't the only former ECW star who would fall into that trap as the years went on, because not long after this, in 2016, it would be Tajiri's turn to make a random comeback when he entered himself into the company's Cruiserweight Classic tournament. But maybe this one shouldn't have been such a surprise because, with WWE's aim here to gather the best cruiserweights from all over the world and have them battle it out for supremacy, it only made sense they would bring in the Japanese buzzsaw for a shot. Sure, he may have been a little bit older than he had been during his initial run in New York during the Attitude Era, but even in his 40s, he was still better in the ring than most. And that was because he'd kept working in the intervening years, with this allowing him to keep himself sharp enough to take on Grand Metalik in the first round of the tournament on July 14th. But while it would be the Lucha star who came out of this one on top come the end, that didn't stop Tajiri from signing a new contract with WWE soon thereafter, with him this time becoming a fixture on both 205 Live and NXT. And it was on this latter brand that he would even get the opportunity to reunite with his old tag team partner William Regal for a while. That said, any reunions would ultimately be cut short when, after suffering a knee injury in January of 2017, Vince McMahon would decide to cut bait on the former Cruiserweight champion, with him feeling like he was too old to return to the main roster at this point. Is this a little ironic given the average age of current main event mainstays like Brock Lesnar, Goldberg, and Edge? Sure, but at least they can perform to the standard which is required of them, the same of which unfortunately can't be said for another figure who returned to WWE in 2017, and that's the Great Khali. To be fair to Khali though, he was never really brought in to be an active wrestler again because, with him barely being able to move on account of his size during his first run, there was little hope he'd be able to do any better on his second. So instead, he'd made a surprise appearance at the June 23rd Battleground pay-per-view, there helping WWE champion Jinder Mahal retain his belt during a Punjabi prison match against Randy Orton. And the reason for this one appears to be that, with him being a legitimate superstar over in his native India, it was felt that bringing Khali in to give the rub to Jinder Mahal would help to get him over with that audience as the company set about doing a tour of the East. Of course, the Giant made sure to use this opportunity to get himself over too when he held up the WWE title himself at the close of the bout, and ultimately, that would contribute towards Mahal failing to get over in a big way with this audience as, when WWE did go over there for their tour later that year, they wouldn't sell as many tickets as they'd hoped. Still, Khali would get to earn another payday regardless when in 2018, he'd appear on the Saudi Arabian show The Greatest Royal Rumble. One person who would not get a Saudi return, however, would be someone who'd initially made his name as a rising star of the mid-card during the late 90s, and that's because when D'Lo Brown made a surprise comeback in 2008, it never really clicked in the same way it had before. Sure, D'Lo could still go in the ring, and he was just as charismatic as he had been in the years prior, but similar to Rob Van Dam's later return, it felt like the company never really had any intentions of using the former Nation of Domination member as anything more than a glorified jobber to the bigger stars. That was why, after spending his first few weeks there upon his return working in dark matches, he'd finally graduate to Raw once more, where his job was to make sporadic appearances throughout the rest of the year, usually putting others over whenever he did show up. Of course, he did get the odd bone thrown his way when he picked up the occasional victory against the likes of Santino Marella, but let's be honest, Santino himself was always more of a comedy figure and never someone known for his own great win-loss record. So could D'Lo have been used more efficiently if he'd been pushed harder at this point? Probably. But given that there were already plenty of bodies on the roster, each of whom were vying for more TV time, it never really worked out that way, and in January of 2009, WWE would announce they had released him from his contract once more. We guess that's just what happens when you were never really a main event player during your first run, and Vince McMahon doesn't see you rising any higher. It's not like Brown is the only example of this after all. No, it was the same with two people who initially came up around the same time as him, and who WWE thought might have some added value in bringing back in during 2016, and that's the Headbangers. Yes, you may have forgotten about this one already given how brief and out of the blue it was, but not long after the brand extension had been reactivated and SmackDown was looking for duos to bolster up their tag team roster, they'd call in a group from the past with the hopes that they'd be able to get some of the more modern tag teams over. But what made this one more surprising than the return of D'Lo Brown was that, despite being a popular mid-card act during the 90s and at one point even becoming WWF Tag Team Champions, the Headbangers would not be looked upon fondly by the company in the years after this. No, in fact, they'd be openly criticized, with a 2007 edition of WWE Magazine labeling them as not being worthy of their title reign, and a Raw 15th Anniversary magazine putting them as number 2 on a list of 15 acts who outstayed their welcome. Still, any lingering issues between the parties must have been solved by 2016, because they were seemingly welcomed back with open arms at this point, providing, of course, they were willing to do the job when called upon. And job they did, as after putting over Rhino and Heath Slater in the first round of the SmackDown Tag Team Championship tournament not long after this, they'd immediately sink into obscurity once more, with them only making one further appearance on the November 15th episode of the Blue Brand before they'd disappear altogether. Yes, maybe WWE hadn't undergone as much of a reassessment of the Headbangers as some might have thought, and their initial negative views of them remained after all. But while they might have been only too happy to vocally voice their displeasure about the Attitude Era tag team, there was no man or woman alive who would dare say anything negative about our next entry. And that's because, with him being widely regarded to be the toughest figure in the entire industry, and one feared by pretty much every wrestler he's ever met, when Haku returned in 2001, he'd be allowed to do and say whatever the hell he wanted. Of course, for some context here, we really should take a step back and look at his near-mythical backstory, as across not only his initial late 80s run in WWF when he worked as a member of the Heenan family, but his time in WCW, Japan, and Mexico too, Haku would develop a reputation as being the toughest wrestler to ever lace up a pair of boots. And this wasn't limited to his in-ring work either. No, in fact, some of the stories of his backstage antics over the years have included him no-selling pepper spray from a cop and then getting into a brawl with a group of them, biting a man's nose off at an airport after he'd said wrestling was fake, and generally being so intimidating towards WCW boss Eric Bischoff that he was too scared to fire him. Even Jake the Snake Roberts, one of the tougher guys of his era, would once famously state that if Haku was running towards him and he had a gun and one bullet with which to defend himself, the first thing he would do was to shoot himself in the head, as he didn't want to risk wounding Haku and making him any angrier. So with this reputation then, you'd have thought that when the Tongan wrestler randomly returned to WWE in 2001 to enter himself into that January's Royal Rumble, the company would capitalize on this and push him to a higher level. Sure, during his first run, he hadn't exactly been a main eventer, but he was a former king of the ring nonetheless. And with the internet starting to make the stories of his wild antics easier to come by for fans, there was now a better understanding of just who he was and why he was so respected. Regardless though, after showing up at the Rumble, Haku would do little of note, as after briefly forming a tag team with Rikishi, he'd be moved down to lower tier shows like Heat and Jacked, there performing against the likes of Hardcore Holly and Shawn Stasiak. Then, come April of 2002, he'd be released from his contract again, leaving us all to wonder why Vince McMahon decided to bring him back in at all. But while we would have loved to have been in the room when the boss was building up the nerve to tell Haku he was being fired, we're pretty sure he wouldn't have found the same worries in 2016, as it was then that a less feared group of performers would make an unexpected return to the company, only to be promptly sent packing all over again. Who are we talking about this time? The Spirit Squad, of course. Yes, the Spirit Squad, WWE's resident group of male cheerleaders, a stable who, in their first run with the company during the mid-2000s, would usually serve as little more than cannon fodder to bigger stars like D-Generation X. Of course, even if they did turn out to be a bit of a flop overall, something good would end up coming out of the whole thing when, by 2009, one of their members, Nikki, would be repackaged as Dolph Ziggler. And with a look and style which echoed Curt Hennig then, Ziggler would go on to become one of the top mid-card acts in WWE over the next couple of decades. That said, his past would come back to haunt him at one point when, while he was feuding with The Miz in 2016, the heel would bring in two of his old stablemates in Mikey and Kenny to attack him ahead of their Intercontinental title match. But given how ineffective they'd been before, it really should have come as no surprise that they would fail to do this, and instead, just 5 days later, Dolph would beat The Miz to win the secondary strap. After that, he'd take on his former teammates in a 2-on-1 handicap match, with him soundly beating them here too. Still, this would not mark the end of the Spirit Squad revival, as after that, Mikey and Kenny would get one more chance for glory when they challenged then SmackDown Tag Team Champions Heath Slater and Rhino for the titles on the October 25th episode of the Blue Brand. Unfortunately though, after failing to win this one, the duo wouldn't be long for the company, and by November, they'd be gone altogether, never to return as of the time of this video's recording. But we don't imagine many fans are mourning that, as, with them never exactly being favorites, most have probably already chosen to forget about them by this point. Two people they will never forget, though, are performers who each first rose to prominence in WCW, with one going on to make a bigger name for himself out east in Japan, all while the other created a truly groundbreaking character in WWF, and that's Vader and Goldust. And why are we packaging these two together? Because in 2005, after Vader's short-lived run in WWF had largely flopped, and Goldust's drug issues had seen him be released a couple of years prior, the two would end up returning to Vince McMahon's promotion as a pair. It all began on the October 31st episode of Raw when, in the build-up to a street fight which was supposed to take place between Jonathan Coachman and Stone Cold Steve Austin, the coach would enlist both the Bizarre One and the Mastodon to come back and be in his corner. Of course, this plan would have to be altered somewhat when, after the Rattlesnake decided against coming out of retirement upon realizing he was going to be pinned by his opponent, a last-minute replacement was found in the form of Batista. So with Goldust and Vader's target now shifting, they would set their sights on interfering and attacking Big Dave when the time for the bout came at Taboo Tuesday, just 1 day later. And though in the end, this would not be enough to help the coach get the win, it would at least lead to Goldust sticking around for a little while longer and even taking part in the 2006 Royal Rumble. But that wouldn't be the only time two figures from the past had returned to the company together, only for one of them to stick around for a while afterwards, as just a year prior, in 2004, it would be the Ministry of Darkness's turn to have a reunion when Gangrel and Viscera re-debuted over on SmackDown. That said, this one wasn't as random as it may have seemed at first, because it was at the point where then WWE Champion JBL was feuding with The Undertaker over the title. So as a former member of the Ministry himself, Bradshaw knew exactly what he had to do to get under his former leader's skin, with this being what led to him calling back in two of their old stablemates on the September 23rd episode of the Blue Brand so as to deliver a beatdown to the Dead Man. After that, they'd even challenge him in a handicap match, with the returnees ultimately losing here despite their best efforts. But while Gangrel would once again disappear once the bout was over, Viscera would continue on with the company when he was rebranded as the world's largest love machine, a gimmick which got to see him come out to the ring in full Hugh Hefner-style regalia, all while flirting with a number of women on the roster, such as Trish Stratus and Lillian Garcia. So in the end, his return proved to be more than just an obscure event. Of course, we can't say the same for everyone we've covered in this video, however, because as we've shown, many of them have since gone mostly forgotten by fans. But even if they weren't all hits, hell, even if some of them were outright misses, we are still glad they happened, as if nothing else, it was nice to see them again, if only for a little while. Of course, we have to say that about Haku though. We're scared as hell he'll find us if we don't. Well guys, what did you think of the video? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to smash the like button, subscribe to the channel, as well as follow Wrestle with Andy on Instagram and Twitter. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Wrestling is often a small world. After all, it historically has been a place where, as a result of kayfabe, you had to know someone in order to get your start in the industry. And even as the years have gone on and kayfabe has fallen away, it's remained something of a family business. Of course, this can lead to some surprising situations where performers you wouldn't expect to be related turn out to be just that. But what are the biggest examples of this? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today. So join us as we take a deep dive in Family Affair, wrestlers you didn't know were related. And if we're going to start anywhere, let's do so with one of the top stars in all of WWE right now, and the man you wouldn't necessarily know is his uncle. Who are we talking about here? Why, Cody Rhodes and Tugboat. Yes, as the brother-in-law to the legendary American Dream Dusty Rhodes, Fred Hochman is actually the maternal uncle of Cody. And that makes him the uncle to Dustin too, as it happens. Sure, this may never have been acknowledged on screen at any point, either in WWE or AEW, but whenever a big family get-together takes place in the Runnels household, you can be sure he'll be there. But who is Fred Ottman, we hear some of you ask? I can sort of remember Tugboat, and even Typhoon. That said, his name rings a bell for some other reason. Well, if you feel this way, you wouldn't be wrong, because in the modern day, he's probably best remembered for being the man behind the infamous Shockmaster. That's right, the most memorable for all the wrong reasons gimmick ever created was helmed by someone who probably looked after both Cody and Dustin as babies. Hell, some of the former's earliest memories of watching wrestling on TV outside of his father likely involved seeing Tugboat in WWF during the late 80s and early 90s. So perhaps it's little surprise that both he and his brother were eventually inspired to lace up their own boots too. We just hope Uncle Fred didn't teach them how to walk around gracefully and not trip over himself. And we also hope he didn't give them any character advice when it came to getting a new gimmick over. But even if he had, he wouldn't be the only person in the extended Rhodes family who was already working in the wrestling business and trying to help them along, because elsewhere, the two grandsons of a plumber had another uncle in Jerry Sags. Of course, Jerry Sags should be better known to audiences as one half of the Nasty Boys, a top tag team act during the golden era WWF. But while his on-screen persona may have been that of a villainous punk, off-screen it appears things were far different for Uncle Jerry, as he was often taking these duties seriously by helping out both Cody and Dustin whenever he could. And it appears at least some of what he said must have rubbed off on them then, because at various points in their career, the Rhodes sons were able to become a star duo in their own right. So successful were they, in fact, that in October of 2013 at WWE's Battleground pay-per-view, they had one of the greatest tag team bouts of their era when they squared off against and beat The Shield. Was any advice Jerry Sags gave them responsible for this? It's hard to say, but it certainly wouldn't have hurt. After all, during his day, Sags was able to become not only a one-time WWF Tag Team Champion, but also a three-time WCW Tag Team Champion, a two-time AWA Southern Tag Team Champion, and a five-time FCW Tag Team Champion as well. So we guess it's just as well Dusty had such a large extended family back in the day then, as it allowed his sons the chance to get all sorts of feedback from different people with various roles within the industry. But then, perhaps it shouldn't come as a surprise the American Dream had two brothers-in-law who were also wrestlers, as with the business being such an insular one during the territory days, people tended to date within their circle. And if that meant starting relationships with the sisters of your coworkers then, well, so be it. Hell, it's exactly what happened with the other nasty boy, Brian Knobbs, when he ended up getting married to the sister of Greg Valentine's wife. Obviously then, this makes the two brothers-in-law as well, and it also shines a whole new light on their various battles against each other when the Hammer was working as part of a tag team with the Honky Tonk Man during the early 90s. Why is that? Well, knowing each other as well as they did, they likely had a greater trust than normal, and so this allowed them to go that extra mile in risking their bodies for the entertainment of fans. Don't get us wrong, we're not suggesting the kind of matches the Nasty Boys and Rhythm and Blues were putting on back then were comparable to the high-risk stuff Kenny Omega and Will Ospreay are giving us today, but as we've seen time and time again, anything which takes place in the ring can lead to injury. So for them to be able to talk things out at the dinner table during family gatherings ahead of time, well, it must have made it a lot easier to enact these plans once the time came for the bell to ring. And if someone accidentally got a little banged up, things could always be sorted out quicker than usual on account of them being related. After all, as the saying in wrestling goes, it's the ones you love you hit the hardest because you know they're going to be okay with it. But what of the other half of Rhythm and Blues, the Honky Tonk Man? Sure, he may not have had any relation to the Nasty Boys, but as a Tennessee native who came up during the time of the legendary Continental Wrestling Association in Memphis, he was able to get his foot in the door there on account of him being the first cousin of Jerry Lawler. Of course, you shouldn't need us to tell you who Jerry Lawler is. After all, he's one of the most famous wrestlers of his era. Yes, back in the 70s and 80s, there were few people outside of Elvis Presley himself who were better known to his hometown populace. And that was because, as the undisputed top star of the Memphis territory, Lawler was basically a superhero to every fan who came to watch him. So using this star power then, he was able to get his cousin, a young Wayne Ferris, his first opportunity when he moved to the city and began teaming with Larry Latham as one half of the Blonde Bombers in 1978. How would this work out for the pair? Pretty well as it happened, because after they took part in the now iconic Tupelo concession stand brawl against Lawler and Bill Dundee in 1979, they were made men. And this helped Ferris to eventually score a job with WWF in 1986, where he then morphed into the Honky Tonk Man. Unfortunately, though, it appears by that point all was not well with him and his cousin, as the two had gone through something of a falling out over money. So while Honky was having a record-setting Intercontinental title run over in New York, the King was back in Memphis, remaining estranged from him. And when Lawler himself went to WWF in 1992, his kin would not be there to greet him, as he'd already be gone. But it wasn't as if there weren't other family members on the roster coexisting at this point, as over in the Intercontinental title scene, Bret Hart was in the midst of a feud with his second cousin, Rowdy Roddy Piper. That's right, believe it or not, but the Hitman and the Rowdy one are actually family, a fact which likely made it a lot easier for them to have a classic together at WrestleMania 8 that year. Hell, it's probably the main reason Piper was so willing to put Bret over clean, as if we know one thing about the kayfabe Scotsman, it's that he didn't do jobs very often during his run in New York. When it came to the Hart family, though, he always had a soft spot, as it was the patriarch of their clan, Stu, who helped him get one of his early breaks in the industry. So because of that, if Bret or any of the other sons of his mentor ever needed help getting over in the future, Roddy was always willing to do whatever it took. In fact, so deep was their relationship, when the Hitman had his stroke in 2002, Piper was the lone wrestler to actually visit him in the hospital, showing you just how much he cared for him and his family. That said, for as heartwarming as this is, the real connection the two shared above all else was their time in the ring together. And that's because when it came down to it, during an era when in-ring work was never less valued in WWF, Bret Hart and Roddy Piper were able to create something which stood out to such a degree, it's still being talked about today. Sometimes, though, relatives in the wrestling industry don't get the chance to work together directly. And this is a particular shame in the case of Matt Bentley, as his cousin is none other than Shawn Michaels. But then to be fair, it's not as if the two ever had much opportunity to intermingle on TV, because after being trained at HBK's Texas Wrestling Academy during the early 2000s, Bentley spent a couple of years trying and failing to secure a job with the likes of WWE and Ring of Honor. It wasn't until he started performing with TNA in 2003, in fact, that something more stable arose for him. But with Shawn Michaels being back in New York at this point, and the two companies having no crossover, it meant there was little hope the two family members would ever get to share the ring together. That said, maybe this was for the best, because, for as great as the Heartbreak Kid is, he might not even have been good enough to get a 5-star classic out of Matt Bentley. Not that Matt was terrible, of course, he just wasn't anything standout. Yes, while he may have looked forward to getting to go one-on-one with his more famous cousin eventually, especially as he regularly borrowed his moves and mannerisms during his own matches, it was less likely fans would have been excited about the whole thing. Nah, they'd probably have tuned out even if they were aware of the familial situation between the pair, as in the mid-2000s, it was all about seeing Michaels have dream bouts against the likes of Chris Jericho and Kurt Angle. Still, even if he was left to do his own thing, Bentley managed to carve out a nice career for himself down in Nashville anyway, as there, he'd become a 2-time X Division champion, with him continuing to remain a featured player all the way up until he left the company in 2007, and in large part, retired from the ring. But we've talked a lot about cousins today, so let's move on to a different family dynamic for a while, as it's not all about extended family when it comes to relatives in the wrestling industry. No, on some occasions, it's a surprising father-son combination which arises, such as the case with Terry Gordy and his offspring, Jesse. Yes, everyone knows Dusty Rhodes is the father of Cody and Dustin, just as we're all too aware Ric Flair is the dad of Charlotte. But what might not be as immediately apparent to most fans is the fact that Terry Gordy, one-third of the legendary Fabulous Freebirds, is actually a direct blood relative of Jesse. Who was Jesse, though? Well, for those watching SmackDown during that hellscape, which was the late 2000s, they might remember a very odd tag team made up of a seemingly feral big guy named Festus, and what appeared to be his handler/best friend, a figure that called himself Jesse. Sure, it may not have been a great gimmick, or even a particularly long-lasting one, but at least it gave the Tennessee native some TV time and a chance to show what he could do to a larger audience. What most watching him back then probably wouldn't have realized, though, was that Jesse came from a very proud lineage of in-ring performers, as back during the territory days, there were few more feared people in the business than Terry Gordy. But then, why would there be? After all, aside from his role as one-third of the Fabulous Freebirds, Gordy was also a well-established singles star, enough to where on 2 separate occasions in the early 90s, he held All Japan Pro Wrestling's Triple Crown Heavyweight Championship. Sadly though, his son would never be able to reach those heights, as once he left WWE in 2010, he'd pretty much retire from the ring altogether. But at least he got to be there for his father's Hall of Fame induction in 2016, so it wasn't like it was all bad. Hell, it could have been a case of not only never getting to work with your family on screen, but also never really getting to interact with them off screen either, which was exactly what happened between Mike Awesome and Hulk Hogan. Wait, what? The Hulkster and that 70s guy are related? Well, technically, because Awesome is actually the cousin of Michael Bolea, better known to most wrestling fans as Horace Hogan, and with Horace being the shoot nephew of the former WWF champion, then it means there is a legitimate, albeit tenuous, connection there. That said, we're not even sure if Hogan is aware he has another relative in the industry, as we've never heard him talk about this one publicly. But then, given how many lies he'd tell regularly, would we believe him if he did? After all, he was the original bass player for Metallica, if you didn't already know. And even if he and the ECW star did have some kind of bond in their personal lives, it's not as if he ever helped Awesome at any point, as during his run in Philly in the mid-90s, he made himself a star all on his lonesome. Well, he did have a little help from Masato Tanaka and some brutal chair shots to the head, we suppose, but aside from that, it was the Tampa native forging his own path. Then, when he finally did make it to WCW in 2000, his association with Terry Bollea didn't really do much to raise his stock there either, as he'd been given a series of embarrassingly bad gimmicks by Vince Russo. In fact, if we didn't know any better, we'd swear Russo and Hogan's blow-up at Bash of the Beach that year actually served as a mark against Awesome, and possibly even led to him effectively getting buried thereafter. So sometimes maybe it doesn't pay to have a more famous relative looking out for you in your career then, as under the right circumstances, this could actually backfire. That said, one person such a thing certainly hasn't backfired for is Zelina Vega, as with the help of her cousin Amazing Red, she was able to get her foot in the door of TNA in 2011 and impress the right people in the process. Yes, before she was in WWE, Via Trinidad actually got her initial break down in Nashville while working under the name of Rosita. And a large part of the reason she got the opportunity to do this at all was because, by this point, her cousin was already a big deal there. That's right, in the 2000s indie scene there were few people more respected than Amazing Red. And given this is an era which also saw the development of the likes of Bryan Danielson, CM Punk, Samoa Joe, and El Generico, that's saying a lot. But why was the Puerto Rican performer so beloved by those in the know at all? Well, whether it be as part of the International Wrestling Association in his home country, Ring of Honor, or yes, even TNA, Red always provided a show-stealing performance, win or lose. In fact, it was his work in the ring which partially inspired his cousin to eventually lace up a pair of boots for herself, as come 2010, she was preparing for her own in-ring debut. Obviously though, while Amazing Red never made it to the bright lights of WWE like so many of his peers, Via would get there in 2017 when she signed on the dotted line with NXT and was at this point rebranded Zelina Vega, business manager of Andrade Cien Almas. And since that point she's gone on to even bigger success as a main roster mainstay and a member of the LWO. Hell, in 2023 she even got to go back to her spiritual home country of Puerto Rico and perform for her people, something her cousin was no doubt very proud of. That said, it's not like the former 3-time X Division champion hasn't been continuing to do great work of his own. No, aside from creating his own promotion called House of Glory, he's also done the odd excursion over to Japan to face off against the likes of Will Ospreay. Will the fact a close family member now works in New York be able to get him a foot in the door in the future? Anything's possible, especially with Triple H having more creative control than ever. Hell, we wouldn't even rule out seeing the family member of another iconic Latino star somewhere down the line. Who are we talking about this time? Why, none other than the son-in-law of the late great Eddie Guerrero, Aiden English. Of course, with Eddie no longer being here, it's not like he can put in a good word for Aiden anymore. Hell, it's unclear if the former vaudevillain ever even got to meet Latino heat in person, as by the time he started dating Shaul Guerrero in the early 2010s, his future father-in-law had already passed. Still, that didn't mean he wasn't a big fan of the former WWE champion growing up, so much so that when he first met his future wife when they were learning the ropes together in the Performance Center, it must have been an intimidating prospect for him to ask her out. But ask her out he did, and from there the two fell in love right around the same time as his career was going through something of a boom in New York. Why was that? Well, this was the period where he first made it to the NXT roster as part of a retro throwback duo alongside Simon Gotch. Sure, his career would never reach much higher than this, outside of a brief period where he served as the Herald of Rusev, and Aiden English certainly never became the star Eddie Guerrero was. But that clearly didn't matter to Shawl, and it clearly didn't matter to her mother Vicky either, as to this day, the Chicago native remains a welcome addition at family gatherings. Would Latino Heat have taken to him the same way? Probably, as the two would have no doubt bonded over their time in the ring. But we guess we'll never know the answer to that question for sure, just as we'll probably never know the answer to the question of whether or not it's possible to have a more bizarre wrestling family tree than the one which includes Bryan Danielson, John Laurinaitis, Road Warrior Animal, and the Bella Twins. Quite a combination, isn't it? Really, it feels like the crossover episode between four sitcoms which were never even a part of the same era. But how are all these parties connected at all? Well, let's go through them one by one and find out. As most people are probably aware by this point, Bryan Danielson is married to Brie Bella and has been since 2014. And of course, with Brie's twin sister being Nikki, this makes her and the American Dragon in-laws too. But what some might not be aware of is the fact that the Bella's mother, Kathy Colas, actually married Johnny Ace a year later in September 2015, making him part of the family as well. Yes, it's easy to imagine Danielson and Laurinaitis sitting down over a vegan dinner discussing the intricacies of pro wrestling. And even though Laurinaitis may have never been on the level of a Danielson in terms of in-ring skill, he certainly knew how to carry himself at one point during his days in Japan. And so did his brother too, because he's not the only Laurinaitis to hit the ring and have success, as he shared a mother and father with Road Warrior Animal himself. That's right, Road Warrior Animal, real name Joe Laurinaitis, is actually the sibling of Johnny Ace, and this makes him a part of the extended family of both Bryan Danielson and the Bellas too then. Of course, while we'd pay good money to see this group of seemingly disparate personalities in a ring together at some point, that's never going to happen now, as Animal sadly passed in 2020. Still, if we play our cards right, we could see a multi-person tag between the American Dragon, his stepfather-in-law, and the Garcia twins over on an episode of Dynamite before all is said and done. Who knows? Given how weird wrestling has been during the last couple of years, we wouldn't even be surprised to see Johnny Ace join the Blackpool Combat Club. But even if they never get a chance to share the screen together, they'll always have their personal time to be around one another, just as everyone else we've discussed today will too. And that's because, at the end of the day, no matter how close you are to your colleagues in the ring, family will always come first. The wrestling world has been home to some great factions over the years. Just look at groups like the Four Horsemen, the NWO, or D-Generation X for evidence of this. That said, for every good example, there's been a handful of bad ones too. And that's because sometimes people can be put together with all the good intentions in the world, only for it to end up failing spectacularly. Of course, sometimes this can be because the people involved don't mesh, or sometimes it can be because the gimmick itself is terrible. But who were the worst of them all? Well, join us today as we take a deep dive into them in Best Left Forgotten, Wrestling's Biggest Failed Factions. And if we're starting somewhere, why not do so with one of the more recent examples of this, because it was only in 2020 that Retribution came and went so quickly, they didn't even get a chance to perform in front of fans. Of course, the reason for this was that it was right in the middle of the global shutdown, a time where, with TV viewership falling fast on account of there being barely any atmosphere during Raw and SmackDown shows, WWE would scramble to try and come up with a big angle so as to draw fans back into the fold. And as it happened, their big idea here was to try and replicate the success of the NWO by bringing in an invading force to take over the show. That said, once they made their presence felt on the August 3rd episode of Raw that year by setting fire to a generator, and then again on SmackDown just 4 days later when they invaded the ringside area with a chainsaw in tow, it quickly became apparent that this was a huge step down from Hogan, Hall, and Nash. No, instead this invasion would be led by T-Bar, Mace, Slapjack, Retaliation, and Reckoning. 5 people who looked and sounded more like goons from the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles than anything else. And sure, the actual performers behind these characters, Dominik Dijakovic, Dio Madden, Shane Thorne, Mercedes Martinez, and Mia Yim, were all talented in their own right, but given what they were being asked to work with here, even they couldn't overcome this handicap. Hell, even Vince McMahon, someone who's been notoriously stubborn when it comes to pushing his ideas no matter what fan reaction is, realized this one was a flop pretty quickly. And that's why, after only a few weeks on the roster, Retribution were relegated to the status of lower card jobbers when they routinely began losing to the Hurt Business in multi-man matches. So seeing the writing on the wall then, Mercedes Martinez would cut bait on the whole angle, with her instead demanding she be returned to NXT, where she could be treated like a more credible threat. But as for the other four, well, they'd be forced to limp on for a while yet. That said, even when WWE tried to add some life to the stable when they revealed that Mustafa Ali had been their secret leader all along, they still wouldn't be able to pick up a win to save their lives. So thankfully then, come the summer of 2021, the whole thing would be laid to rest as each of the members went off on their own at this point and tried their best to recover from the damage that had been done to their characters. Of course, this isn't the only time an invasion angle has failed miserably in WWE though, and no, we're not talking about the Alliance either. What we are talking about instead is something which came a few years prior to that, as in 1997, right as the boom period was about to start and a new edgy era of wrestling was taking hold. Jim Cornette would attempt to bring some old school tradition back to things with the National Wrestling Alliance. Yes, back in the 90s, Cornette still had a lot of sway in the WWF, so when he suggested leading a group of NWA stars onto Raw at this point, the idea was quickly approved. And so it was then that on the December 30th episode of the Red Brand that year, he'd have WWF host a match between Jeff Jarrett and Barry Windham over the then vacant NWA North American Heavyweight Championship. But after helping Jarrett to win this one, it quickly became clear that Jim wasn't content with the legendary governing body getting just one segment on Raw. Now, as far as he was concerned, wrestling was getting too far away from its roots, and the National Wrestling Alliance was just what was needed to bring it back under order. That was why, as the weeks went on, he'd bring in other NWA stars of old such as the Rock and Roll Express, all while adding new recruits in the form of Bradshaw, Bob Holly, and Bart Gunn too. The only problem here was that by then, it was the beginning of 1998 and no one cared about the old traditions of wrestling anymore. No, what they wanted to see was Steve Austin raising hell, D-Generation X breaking the rules, or Mick Foley carrying out death-defying stunts. So with the NWA invasion feeling very much passé then, the group would be slowly taken off TV at this point. In fact, by August of that year, it would be gone completely after Vince McMahon decided to ban the group from being featured on any further WWF shows in the future. Yes, there was a long time ago when the boss had his finger on the pulse of what people wanted, and this would be a prime example of that. It's just a shame that the same couldn't be said for another invasion-themed stable that would come years later then, because rather than have him kill the Nexus off after they'd failed in their hostile takeover attempt in 2010, McMahon would instead decide to rebrand them as the New Nexus, in hopes that this would revive it. Of course, as anyone who's watched wrestling for a decent length of time will tell you though, adding a new prefix to the start of something is pretty much always a recipe for disaster. And the New Nexus would be no different then, as with all their credibility already being dead here, no one was going to take them seriously again, no matter what they did. Sure, the company did try when they booked CM Punk to take over the group and subsequently announced that he was going to beat it into shape, but even with the voice of the voiceless being one of the more over figures on the roster at this point, his spot as the new leader of the Nexus never really felt like it made sense. No, instead it all just felt a bit too forced, something which caused a number of the original group members to exit stage right over the weeks that followed. So needing to replace them then, Punk would bring in some fresh blood in the form of Mason Ryan, a performer who most people have long since forgotten by now, and for good reason. What's more, despite being the leader of the group, as time went on, CM Punk would feel like he had less and less association with them. So little would he have in fact that, after he cut his now famous pipe bomb promo on John Cena on the June 20th, 2011 episode of Raw, his time with the New Nexus would never be mentioned again. Yes, this faction were so far down on the food chain by this point that their leader quitting didn't even get a storyline explanation. And things weren't much better for their counterparts over on SmackDown at the same time either, because there, the core were struggling to get anyone to pay attention to them. That's right, after the original incarnation of the Nexus had been dissolved in late 2010, the members would branch off into two separate factions. And while for most of them this meant hanging around on Raw while CM Punk took over shop, For Wade Barrett, Heath Slater, Justin Gabriel, and Ezekiel Jackson, it meant shifting over to SmackDown and starting their own splinter cell named the Core. Unfortunately for them, though, if the original Nexus crashed and burned spectacularly, and the new Nexus was a failure from day one, the Core somehow ended up being the worst of all three. And that's because, without a main event star to at least give the illusion that they were a credible threat, Barrett, Slater, Gabriel, and Jackson would pretty quickly turn into some of the Blue brand's biggest jobbers. Sure, they would find some small measures of success during their time together, such as when Gabriel and Slater became WWE Tag Team Champions for a while after they beat the powerhouse duo of Santino Marella and Vladimir Kozlov. But by that point in time, those belts meant so little that winning them at all was more of a consolation prize than anything else. And the same could really be said for Wade Barrett's run with the Intercontinental title here, a run which started when he beat Kofi Kingston for the honor, though in his case, the downfall hurt that much more because at one time, before he was literally buried by John Cena, he had the potential to be a world champion. But things didn't work out that way for him, and as the weeks and months went on, the Core would lose all their belts and continue to slide further into irrelevancy. And after refusing to celebrate with the rest of his teammates following a victory, Ezekiel Jackson would be given the boot. Not long after that, Barrett himself would follow suit, walking out on the stable and leaving Gabriel and Slater, by then the only two remaining members, to officially dissolve the whole thing on June 10th. And as it happened, this wouldn't be the only failed faction Heath Slater ended up being a part of throughout his run with WWE, because after spending a lengthy period as one of the company's perennial pin eaters, he'd get to lead another group in 2016 when he formed the Social Outcasts. Who were the Social Outcasts? Well, they were basically a modern version of the Job Squad, being made up as they were of career jobbers Slater, Curtis Axel, Bo Dallas, and Adam Rose. Unlike the Job Squad, though, this faction would never really get a chance to win over the hearts of fans because after forming in January of 2016, they'd only get 5 months together before the whole thing was scrapped. And during these 5 months, most of their appearances would see them lose to more important performers, such as the time that Axel and Dallas lost a tag team bout against the Usos, or when all 4 members lost a 3-on-4 handicap match with the Wyatt family. So perhaps it was a mercy then that, after Adam Rose requested, and was subsequently granted his release from the company in May, the rest of the group would go their separate ways, with Axel and Dallas going on to join the Miz Taraj, all while Heath Slater found another lease on life as part of a tag team act with Rhino over on SmackDown. Of course, Slater wasn't the only former Nexus member who was forced to be a part of a pretty bad stable around this point in time, however, because while he was doing so, slightly higher up on the card, Wade Barrett would be shacking up with the League of Nations. And if you've already forgotten about this one, it's because it pretty much existed for one reason, and one reason only, to get Roman Reigns over as a babyface, a task which felt near enough impossible in the winter of 2015. Yes, after Irish superstar Sheamus had successfully cashed in his Money in the Bank contract on the Big Dog at that November Survivor Series, he decided to build an army around himself so as to ensure he wouldn't lose his newly won title anytime soon. And going with an all-international theme for this group then, he'd start aligning himself with English-born Wade Barrett, the Bulgarian Brute Rusev, and Mexican wrestling royalty and then United States champion Alberto Del Rio. Of course, I shouldn't go without saying that there was almost a 5th member to this group too, Canadian hero Kevin Owens. In fact, the only reason he'd never ended up joining the League of Nations was that, on the night they formed, he missed the show on account of being sick. But we're sure he's secretly thankful for that because as the weeks went on, it quickly became clear that the League were going to be treated like little more than henchmen for Reigns to work his way through en route to getting his WWE title back from Sheamus. Still, even if this was their eventual fate, the least the company could have done would have been to make them look like a serious threat in the meantime. Instead of doing this, though, they'd all be treated like complete failures, with them at one point actually losing to Roman in a 4-on-1 handicap match on the December 3rd episode of SmackDown. Then, when the Big Dog finally did get his title back, the League of Nations would sink into complete mid-card irrelevance when, not only did Del Rio lose his United States title to Kalisto, but the group as a whole would be embarrassed upon getting beat up by Steve Austin, Shawn Michaels, and Mick Foley at WrestleMania 32. So feeling like they needed to do something to get themselves going again, the League would kick Barrett out of the group after deeming him to be the weak link. But as it turned out, even this wouldn't be able to help them turn their fates around, because from there, they'd continue to lose to the likes of the Wyatt family, all before the remaining 3 members came to blows themselves and decided they couldn't work together anymore. Yes, after less than a year together, this failed faction would be no more. But if you thought they were a somewhat forgotten stable, then we've got an even better one for you yet. And that's because the next group we're going to look at is the Union. Who were the Union? Well, in May of 1999, after growing tired of Shane McMahon's megalomaniac ways, 4 performers, namely Mankind, Ken Shamrock, Test, and The Big Show, would all come together to prove that as long as they stood by each other's side, then they'd always have strength in numbers. Of course, with this still being the period where Vince Russo was writing the show, the full name of the stable would actually be the Union of People You Oughta Respect, Son, or, in short, up yours. Still, bad puns aside, there was a lot of star power in this group, so why has it gone so forgotten in the years since then? Well, that's because they never really got a chance to do much during the run. Yes, like every other attempt to get a wrestlers union going in the past, this one would pretty much be nipped in the bud before it could build any momentum. And part of the reason for this was the fact that, for pretty much the entire time they were active, Mick Foley was out injured. So with the other 3 members being forced to pick up the slack then, they'd try to get the better of Shane and the rest of the corporate ministry over the weeks which followed. And while they would largely fail to do this, they would at least score a victory one week when, after each active member was given the opportunity to have a match against anyone they wanted by then acting CEO Steve Austin, Test would choose Stephanie McMahon. That said, it wasn't a wrestling match he had in mind, no, it was a date. And so thus would begin the storyline where he became the brief fiancé to the billion-dollar princess, much to the chagrin of Shane, of course. And in the end, with the group dissolving soon after this, the Test and Stephanie angle would in many ways become the lasting legacy of the Union. But as we'll see with our next entry, sometimes it's better to go forgotten entirely than to be remembered for all the wrong reasons, something that the X Factor can personally attest to. That's right, in perhaps the biggest failed stable of the Attitude Era, X-Pac, Justin Credible, and Albert would form a trio that would go down forever in infamy. But to be fair to them, it wasn't because they weren't capable wrestlers. No, in fact, Sean Waltman in particular was one of the best on the roster. By this point though, his greasy character, one which had failed to evolve since his days in DX, had grown so tiresome to fans that a term would actually go on to be created for how much people viscerally hated him: X-Pac heat. And when his 2 stablemates got involved with him, they'd quickly be sucked into this vortex of hatred too, with them becoming the #1 heels on the mid-card for a time, even after everyone in WWF was supposed to have turned face during the invasion. Of course, if we're talking about elements of their act which made them even more hated though, we can't ignore that terrible theme song from Uncle Kracker, one of the worst pieces of music ever written. So bad in fact that it makes Brie Mode sound like it should be in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. But that's not to say the group didn't find some success during their short time together in 2001, because while a unit, X-Pac would become both a cruiserweight and light heavyweight champion, and Albert would become an intercontinental champion too. Still though, with it at a certain point being clear that there was nothing they could do to get over with fans, X Factor would go their separate ways in October of that year. And sure, while this was a short-lived group, it still wasn't as short-lived as one that came a couple of years prior, because in August of 1999, after Edge and Christian had split from Gangrel, he would decide he needed to form a new brood around him with the Hardy Boys. Yes, it's largely gone forgotten now, but during some of those early classic ladder matches between the Hardys and Edge and Christian, the former were actually members of the Brood. Of course, given the fact that there was nothing really gothic about them, the whole thing looked pretty silly from day one. And that was why no one ever really bought Matt and Jeff as being a part of Gangrel's vampire lifestyle then, especially as in the brief moments they'd been seen by fans before this, they resembled something far closer to alternative skateboarding kids. Sure, it did give the company an excuse to put them on the opposite side of the ring from a team who would arguably go on to be their biggest rivals, but this really could have been done a million other ways. So luckily, with everyone backstage pretty quickly realizing this one was a flop, the Hardys would shift their allegiances away from Gangrel after only a couple of months, from there turning babyface and morphing into the high-risk thrill-seekers we would all come to know and love. But don't let any of this make you think that it's only WWE who know how to make bad factions, because while they're still a young company, All Elite Wrestling are no strangers to this either. Sure, they've given us some of the best in recent years with groups like the Blackpool Combat Club, Death Triangle, and the Inner Circle, but on the opposite side of this, we've had to suffer through things like the early days of the Dark Order, the Hardy Family Office, and worst of all, the Nightmare Collective. Where to start with this one? Well, despite initially being portrayed in AEW as the chief brand officer, Brandy Rhodes would begin branching out early on in the company's run when she became the on-screen manager to Awesome Kong. Unfortunately though, with Kong being pretty banged up at this point and limited to what she could do in the ring, it was decided to take the whole thing in a far more sports entertainment direction instead. And considering being the anti-WWE was something AEW had built their platform on, this decision did not go down well with fans, as over the next few weeks, they watched Brandy morph into some kind of voodoo queen, a figure who, along with Kong, would regularly try to integrate new recruits into her Nightmare Collective by having them offer a sacrifice, such as shaving their heads in the ring. But while this gimmick would probably have never gotten over at any point in time, it was really hampered here by the fact that Tony Khan was already booking a cult stable over in the men's division, with this one being the, at the time, struggling Dark Order. Yes, before they became lovable babyface goofs, the Dark Order was supposed to be All Elite Wrestling's #1 threat. And this meant that, with the Nightmare Collective doing little of note over in the pretty weak women's division, they just looked like jobbers by comparison. Even the eventual introduction of new members like deathmatch legend Dr. Luther couldn't help to get things going here, in fact, and so, by a certain point, fans in attendance would actually start to reject the whole thing, with this probably being the first instance of such a thing happening in AEW. Thankfully though, in the end, Brandy would realize this, and so, in February of 2020, she would air segments on AEW social media accounts revealing that she had gone to therapy and returned to her old self. And this would immediately give her the excuse she needed to disband the faction, from there returning to her role as on-screen ally to her husband Cody. Wrestling has had a long and storied history of lengthy gimmicks which have stood the test of time. In the modern era alone, in fact, the likes of John Cena's patriotic babyface star, Randy Orton's slimy heel, and Brock Lesnar's Hulk on steroids characters have already seen them find success across 3 different decades. And if you want to go even further back than that, you can find any number of lengthy gimmicks, such as Ric Flair, Hulk Hogan, or Gorgeous George, each of which gave the person behind them years' worth of success. But what happens when a gimmick doesn't quite have that staying power, either because it wasn't quite working or because something better came along for the performer? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today. So join us as we journey into the world of the lost and the forgotten in Brief Encounters, wrestling's short-lived gimmicks. And where better to start then than with the original gimmick of the man who has, in the years since, gone on to become arguably the biggest star in all of wrestling, and that's Roman Liaki. Of course, before he was the tribal chief, before he was the big dog, even before he was the enforcer of the Shield, Roman was a young rookie hoping to make a name for himself in WWE's developmental brand at the time, Florida Championship Wrestling. And given his lineage as part of the NOIE family, combined with his prior runs in the football world as part of both the Minnesota Vikings and the Jacksonville Jaguars, he wouldn't have to work hard to get noticed, as realizing how big of a potential star they had on their hands early on, the company would get hard to work on molding him to meet his full potential. This then would see him debut in FCW in 2010 then as Roman Liaki, a cocky heel who, always dressed sharply in a suit, would regularly inform his opponents about how much better he was than them. But it wasn't like this was all talk, as when it came time to hit the ring, he'd be able to back this up with his fists too, with this thirst to win ultimately being what saw him defeat then FCW Florida Heavyweight Champion Leo Kruger in a non-title match in January of 2012. Had he stayed on with the developmental territory after that, then it's likely he would have been the champion himself before long. In the end though, before this could happen, FCW would be rebranded as NXT, with Liaki at this point changing his ring name to Roman Reigns. And it was this name that he would take up to the main roster with him just a few months later when, at November 18, 2012's Survivor Series pay-per-view, he, Seth Rollins, and Dean Ambrose would all debut together as The Shield. Yes, at this point, Roman's career would take a dramatic turn as he quickly rocketed up the card. That said, it wouldn't be until he went back to his heelish roots in 2020 that he would finally get over with fans in a major way, proving that maybe he'd been onto something way back in the beginning all along. Of course, not all short-lived characters lead to bigger success for the performers behind them after the fact though, as in the case of Emelina, things would not go as well. And what made this one worse is that prior to her rebranding, over on NXT, Australian wrestler Emma had already found success as a goofy babyface who liked to badly dance her way to the ring. But it wasn't just dancing that got her over, as when it came time to hit the ring herself, she would be able to put on some early bangers with Paige that, in hindsight, represented the very first sparks of the company's women's revolution. Upon reaching the main roster in 2014, though, she would never be able to find the same level of success as her chief rival, with her instead quickly falling into an undercard comedy role as the on-screen ally of Santino Marella. So realizing that things needed to be shaken up, WWE would take her off TV for a while in 2016, with them at this point beginning the very, very long tease of her eventual return as Emelina. Yes, this one would go on for such a lengthy period that it would eventually turn into a bit of a joke amongst fans, with many wondering if the re-debut would ever happen after a certain point. Then, to make matters worse, Emelina would finally make her debut on the February 13, 2017 episode of Raw, only for her then to immediately announce that she would now begin the transition of returning to Emma once more. Why was it so abrupt? Was it just some in-joke being played by people behind the scenes? Well, if rumors are to be believed, the whole thing was actually supposed to go on for longer, but upon seeing that the naturally goofy Emma was struggling to play the more sexualized Sable-like gimmick, the company decided to switch gears and have her go back to her old look instead. So in terms of short-lived gimmicks, this one has to rank right up there at the top, as lasting for only one segment, it never even had an opportunity to get over with fans. As for the next performer we're going to be looking at though, they can't say the same thing, as despite only being around for a short time, the Patriot would spend most of it in the main event scene. It was way back in 1997, in fact, that, looking for someone who could challenge then WWF champion Bret Hart during the ongoing Canada vs. USA storyline, Jim Ross pitched for journeyman wrestler Del Wilkes to be brought in for the role. So, seeing something in the idea, Vince McMahon would agree to this, as from there, Wilkes was hired and rebranded as the Patriot, an all-American babyface who wore a Stars and Stripes mask, carried an American flag, and came out to the ring to a suspiciously similar-sounding theme song.
Weighing 270 pounds, the Patriot!
Yes, it had all the makings of an old-school patriotic character, but unfortunately for Del Wilkes, with this being the era of the anti-hero, fans weren't as interested in him as they may have been in the years prior. That was how, after unsuccessfully challenging the Hitman for the WWF title at September 7th's Ground Zero in Your House, then teaming with Vader to take on Hart the British Bulldog in a flag match at the following month's Bad Blood in Your House, the Patriot would fall to the wayside, with him leaving the company altogether soon thereafter upon picking up a pretty bad tricep injury, which ultimately forced him to retire. But it wasn't as bad as it could have been, however, because for as short of a run as the Patriot ultimately had, at least he got to keep his dignity, the same of which can't be said for Paul and Katie Lee Burchill. Yes, this one is remembered for all the wrong reasons, as after spending a period on mid-2000s SmackDown as Pirate Paul Burchill, the company's answer to Captain Jack Sparrow, the cruiserweight star would be paired up with German indie performer Katharina Walters for an altogether more controversial gimmick. That's right, this was the one that saw Waters play the role of Katie Lee Burchill, the on-screen sister and, at times, apparent lover to Paul. Look, no one can ever accuse Vince McMahon of being a normal guy, and with this idea being his apparent brainchild after years of having tried to get some kind of incest storyline on WWE TV, he finally had a chance to let loose with it, even if both the performers involved and the fans watching probably wish they could forget the whole thing ever happened. Now, that said, there was never anything blatant to the love affair between the siblings. The company had sponsors to think about after all. But between the act's debut in 2008 and its eventual end, enough hints would be dropped so that even the least perceptive of fans could figure out what was really going on. Luckily then, after runs on both the Raw and ECW brands, by 2010 it would be no more. And with Vince McMahon hopefully having finally gotten the idea out of his system now, we can move on and pretend the whole thing was a bad dream. What we never want to forget about, though, is one of the best short-lived gimmicks in WWE history, with that being Man Mountain Rock. But let's be clear, Man Mountain Rock, played as he was by indie performer Max Payne, wasn't necessarily a good character. He wasn't even necessarily an entertaining character. What he was, though, was someone so ridiculous looking that we're just glad it existed. Yes, missing out on the heavy metal craze by about a decade or so, Vince McMahon decided that 1995 was the perfect time to debut the gimmick of a guitar virtuoso who frequently rocked his way down to the ring with his WWF logo-shaped instrument. Of course, unlike Elias years later, this one would fail to get over with fans, with the grunge audience of the time having little interest in what he was selling them. And despite Vince McMahon acting as his biggest cheerleader on commentary, it would all ultimately lead to Man Mountain Rock being dropped soon thereafter, albeit not before he got to have a career highlight when his thrashing skills raised the ire of Bob Backlund, leading to the two having a brief comedy feud that gave fans something good to remember the whole thing by. But finding good things to remember a short-lived gimmick by turns into a far more difficult task when we look at another character that only had a brief run a year or so following this. Yes, it was in 1996 when WWF was transitioning out of the New Generation era into one with far more attitude that Terry Gordy would get one last run with the company as the Executioner. Gordy himself had long been a well-respected figure in wrestling by this point, with his time working for the likes of World Class Championship Wrestling, Memphis CWA Wrestling, All Japan Pro Wrestling, and Extreme Championship Wrestling prior to this, helping him earn a well-deserved reputation. By the dawn of the Attitude Era, however, he was starting to get on in years, and that was why, after Vince McMahon brought him back to play the latest foil to The Undertaker, he would decide it was better to put him under a mask so as to hide his age from the audience and protect his legacy if it turned out he couldn't go to the same level anymore. Yes, this was back during the time when WWF was undergoing a youth kick, with anyone over the age of 40 being deemed to be well past their prime. So upon his debut as the newest client of Paul Bearer then, fans would have little idea it was the former territory star behind the mask. All they saw instead was the Executioner, someone who came down to the ring with a scythe in hand, seemingly ready to send heads rolling at a moment's notice. But once the bell rang, things would not go to plan for the heel as, in his only real notable bout, taking on the Deadman in an Armageddon Rules match at December's In Your House 12 It's Time, he would be soundly defeated. After this then, he would quickly fall into the background as, by 1997, he would be gone altogether. And as it turned out, he wouldn't be the only short-lived gimmick who appeared around this time, as just a few weeks before the Executioner had his cup of coffee in New York going up against The Undertaker, a hot new prospect would have made his debut, and that was Brachus. Yes, Brachus, portrayed by German former bodybuilder Achim Albrecht, had caught the attention of Vince McMahon not long prior to this, and given his absolutely monstrous physique making him look like a prototype of both Dave Bautista and Brock Lesnar, it's not hard to see why the boss would fall in love with him. In fact, if he had his way, then Brachus would have likely been pushed to the moon as quickly as possible, with him probably ending up challenging for the WWF title before long. In reality, however, things did not go quite like this. Not that it was for lack of trying, though, as after appearing at house shows and on dark matches throughout the tail end of 1996 and into 1997, vignettes would begin airing, hyping up his big debut. And in these, he would make it known that his first task in WWF was to take out Vader, with the big man specifically calling out the Mastodon. Unfortunately, though, before he could make it to TV, McMahon would realize that he wasn't quite ready yet, and that if he really wanted his new star to make the impact he hoped he might, he would first have to send him to ECW for a while so as to get some seasoning. So that was how, in March of 1998, Brachus would return, only to then immediately lose his first match to Goldust on an episode of Shotgun Saturday Night. That's right, it wasn't the kind of debut you'd want out of a monster heel, and it didn't get much better from there as, after entering himself into the infamous Brawl for All later that year, he'd lose to Savio Vega in the first round, pretty much killing any of his tough guy aura right there. After that, he wouldn't be long for the company, as instead of main eventing with the likes of Steve Austin, Brachus would be working in lower card matches on the rare times he did appear on TV. And by the summer of 1999, he'd be gone altogether, with this marking an end to a run which could have been so much more. But the phrase "could have been more" can't necessarily be applied to our next entry, as when Gunnar Scott made his debut on SmackDown in 2006, it soon became clear things were not going to go well. And that's a shame because, by this point, Brent Albright, the man behind the character, had 2 years of seasoning time in Ohio Valley Wrestling, with him becoming both the OVW Heavyweight Champion, OVW Television Champion, and an OVW Southern Tag Team Champion while he was there. And at least initially upon being moved up to the blue brand in 2006, things would play out in much the same vein, as now being rebranded as Gunner Scott, he would make a quick impact when he scored a pinfall victory over Booker T. After that, he'd even get to partner up with Chris Benoit to take on Booker and Finlay, with Gunner getting another pinfall over the 5-time WCW champion here. In the end, however, this would prove to be his high point on the main roster as, following this, things would begin to falter, with it all eventually coming to a close in less than dramatic fashion when, upon losing a match to Mr. Kennedy that June, then being destroyed by the Great Khali after the bout and shoved into a body bag, the newcomer would be sent back down to OVW. And the reason for this was that, feeling like he wasn't quite living up to the lofty expectations the company had for him, Vince McMahon would want him to get trained up some more before he made his eventual return. Of course, this return would never happen in the end, as in October of that year, Gunner Scott would be released from his contract, leaving him to have to seek employment in the likes of TNA, Ring of Honor, and Pro Wrestling Noah instead. But then he wasn't alone in this, as just a few years later, someone who had been making a name for themselves on the South American wrestling circuit, Eric Perez, would find an equal level of difficulty in WWE as Eric Escobar. And this one would start in 2009 as, after having spent some time in both Deep South Wrestling and Florida Championship Wrestling, two of WWE's then developmental territories, Perez would be called up to the main roster, where he'd be asked to portray the new gimmick, with this one initially being based on the Jonathan Goldsmith character of the most interesting man in the world from the Dos Equis beer ad campaign. Upon that idea being dropped, however, things would quickly be reworked as, instead, Eric Escobar became a more villainous cartel member-like figure, one who would find some early success over on SmackDown when he aligned himself with on-screen general manager Vicky Guerrero. On top of that, he'd also help build his stock by picking up wins over the likes of Matt Hardy at this point, making it seem like the future was indeed bright for the Puerto Rican star. That, however, would all begin to change when, upon losing an Intercontinental title match to John Morrison, Vicky Guerrero would drop him, with this leading to Escobar turning face as a result. And while for many, a babyface turn would be a sign of good things to come, for the newcomer, it would mark the beginning of the end, as after losing a number of handicap matches against teams such as the Hart Dynasty and Jericho, Escobar would be further punished by the GM when he was forced to go one-on-one with Kane on December 18th of that year. And after losing this one, he would be released from the company altogether, with him from there returning to the indie circuit where he would continue to make a living up until his retirement in 2015. But of course, it isn't just WWE who've given us some short-lived gimmicks over the years, as back in 2001, WCW were putting out a team who, at least one half of, would later find much greater success as a main eventer, and that was Air Raid. Yes, this was the team made up of Air Paris and Air Styles, two young high flyers who, clad in G-suits, looked set to make a splash in the company's cruiserweight division upon their debut that February. And while they were indeed both very talented performers, with them at one point even gaining a victory over then WCW Tag Team Champions the Boogie Knights, things would never really get the chance to go much further than that. But this one can't really be blamed on the company, as the reason for the gimmick's abrupt end would be that, just a month later, WCW would go under, with it being bought out by Vince McMahon from there. And deciding that he didn't want to keep the contracts of Air Raid going forward then, he would release both men, with them from there each journeying out onto the indie scene so as to make a name for themselves. Of course, each would do this to very different degrees in the years that followed, as while Air Paris would spend the next decade largely staying on the indies, Air Styles would make a major splash in both TNA and Ring of Honor as AJ Styles, with him working with the former for a full 13 years, all before then jumping over to New Japan Pro Wrestling and taking over control of the Bullet Club from Prince Devitt. After that, he'd become an even bigger star, gaining worldwide notoriety, enough so that, in 2016, he could join WWE, and there, quickly establish himself as a major player, becoming a two-time WWE champion in the process. So given what he would go on to do, it's easy to forget the humble beginnings that AJ had then. And the same too could really be said for another figure who would go on to have far greater success in the years that followed, because before he was the Attitude Era's favorite dancing Samoan, Rikishi would be saddled with the gimmick of Make a Difference Fatu. Yes, this came after the Anoa'i family member had undergone a successful run in the early 90s tag team division as one half of the Head Shrinkers. So, hoping to propel him towards equal levels of singles greatness following this then, Vince McMahon would recast Rikishi as Make a Difference Fatu in 1995, with his hope here being that, by portraying Rikishi as a positive role model, one who told kids to stay away from drugs and go to school, the big man would turn out to be a hit with the young audience watching at the time. Ultimately, however, even though the Attitude Era was still a few years away yet, the mid-90s audience would still find this one to be a little too forced and cheesy for their tastes, even if the future innovator of the stink face tried his best to get it over by picking up a number of early wins against various enhancement talent on Superstars. And while this was happening, a grander plan for the character would even begin to be teased, as throughout many of his matches, his real-life cousins Samu and Lloyd Anoa'i, then known as the Samoan Gangsta Party, would start appearing in the audience during his matches. That said, it would never end up going any further than that, as by the time 1996 rolled around, it was clear that the die had been cast on the gimmick. Yes, after picking up some notable losses to the likes of Steve Austin, Vader, and Hunter Hearst Helmsley, the whole thing would be dropped, with Make a Difference Fatu making way then for his equally as short of gimmick in the Sultan. Still, Rikishi was able to ride this one out too, and a couple of years later, he'd finally get to make it to the main event. It's just a shame that the same can't be said for some of the other gimmicks in this video, as while not all of them were winners, a select few could have been far more than they were given the chance to be. And as for those like Roman Reigns or AJ Styles who did go on to greater things, even if in their earlier incarnations they'd almost gone forgotten forever. Well guys, what did you think of the video? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to smash the like button, subscribe to the channel, as well as follow Wrestle with Andy on Instagram and Twitter. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Some people are just meant to be part of a tag team. Take someone like Road Dogg, for example, or even Road Warrior Animal. Sure, they've each had solo runs in the past, but it just wasn't the same without their partners there. That said, there have been times when great tag teams have split up, and it's led to the people involved reaching even bigger heights. But what are the biggest examples of this in wrestling history? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today. And where better to start than with one of the biggest examples of this phenomenon, and that's Edge and Christian. Yes, while they may have been on top of the world in Turn of the Millennium WWF as a duo, a team so good they won all 3 of the TLC Triangle Ladder matches, which made the era famous, once Edge and Christian parted ways in 2001, things reached a whole new level for the pair. And that's because now solo acts for the first time, they were able to give fans something different. And this led to Edge in particular reaching massive levels of success which all began with him winning the King of the Ring that same year. But it wouldn't end there for the Rated R Superstar, because just a few years after this, he'd win the inaugural Money in the Bank contract, then go on to successfully cash this in against John Cena at January 8th, 2006's New Year's Revolution pay-per-view. Then, once that reign came to an end, he'd win the top prize a further 10 times before all was said and done, with him spending a large portion of this part of his career as the face of SmackDown. Sure, it might have taken Christian a little bit longer to reach the same heights, as Vince McMahon never really saw as much in him for whatever reason, but he'd get there eventually too. He'd just have to leave WWE in order to do so for the most part, and that's because, prior to his 2 brief World Heavyweight title runs on SmackDown saw him threaten to break through to the main event full-time, he'd move over to TNA, where he had a great run there, and became a World Heavyweight Champion a further 3 times over. Then there's also his current run with All Elite Wrestling, where he's reached a whole new level of great heel work altogether. But the Canadian isn't the only person this has happened to over the years, as 2 of Edge and Christian's greatest rivals during the Attitude Era also had a similar career trajectory when they went solo. Who are we talking about here? Why, the Hardy Boys, of course. That's right, well, as a pair, the brothers from North Carolina reached heights few could ever have foreseen for them. As solo acts, they arguably did even more. After all, each of them were at various points able to reach the top of the card by themselves, and the first to do this was Jeff, as following the first breakup of the Hardys in 2002, he went on to become a main event player over on Raw for a while, with him at one point getting to have a particularly memorable ladder match with The Undertaker over the WWE Undisputed title. Sadly though, he wouldn't win this one. No, his big moment wouldn't come until a few years later when, after reaching such levels of popularity with fans that he was starting to outsell John Cena at the merch stands, he'd defeat both Triple H and Edge to win the WWE Championship for the first time at December 14th, 2008's Armageddon pay-per-view. As for Matt's journey post-breakup of the Hardys, like with Christian Cage, he'd take a little bit longer to get there. But once he did, he'd arguably be a bigger star because of this. And that's because when he finally did come up with a main event gimmick while working for Impact, a gimmick that went by the name of Broken Matt Hardy, it changed the entire industry in many ways. How could this be true? Well, his pioneering use of the cinematic style of match would become a lifesaver for many promotions just a few years later during the lockdown. And the deep lore he built around his whole Pocket Hardy universe certainly inspired others like Bray Wyatt to do the same with The Fiend. Hell, because of the great work he's done over the last decade, you could now argue he's the bigger of the two siblings in terms of star power. And that's something no one would have ever imagined could have been true back in the days when the charismatic enigma was all anyone wanted to talk about. So it just goes to show the positive impact a well-timed split can have for a tag team, as it can lead to all people involved becoming superstars in their own right. Still need more evidence of what we're telling you is true? Well then, let's cast our minds back in time a little to 2014, as it was then The Shield broke up after an 18-month run on top. But while this could have been a disaster, as when the trio of Roman Reigns, Seth Rollins, and Dean Ambrose were nigh on unstoppable, it ended up being the best thing that could have happened to them, as each has since gone on to dominate the industry in their own way. In fact, if you look at the major leagues of North America today, it's pretty much an image of the Hounds of Justice being above everyone else. It doesn't matter if it's Raw, where Seth Rollins is the king of the brand as the current World Heavyweight Champion, SmackDown, where Roman Reigns has held the undisputed WWE Universal title for going on 4 years now, or AEW, where the now renamed Jon Moxley is a record 3-time world champion and undisputed ace of the company. The Shield have dominated everywhere they've gone. And given they're all still in their 30s, it doesn't look like that domination is going to end anytime soon, even if we never get to see them all in a ring together at the same time again. Really, you could argue that in the modern day, there's no better example of a breakup done right, as this one took 3 guys who were relative nobodies just over 2 years before and drove them to the absolute biggest heights of the wrestling industry. Hell, so dominant have they been, there was even one night at June 19th, 2016's Money in the Bank pay-per-view where they all held the world title within 10 minutes of each other. And none of this would have happened had they not gone their separate ways and explored what they could be as solo acts. Just as our next subjects could never have reached the same heights had they not done the same thing in 1993. That's right, it's time to talk about the Hollywood Blondes. Stone Cold Steve Austin, arguably the biggest star the wrestling industry has ever created. Brian Pillman, one of the greatest and most groundbreaking gimmicks that ever was. It might be hard for younger fans that weren't there at the time to believe, but these two legends were actually once a tag team. Yes, back in 1992, before Austin became the Rattlesnake and before Pillman became the Loose Cannon, the two were a pair of rookies looking for their big break. And that big break came when WCW, their employer at the time, decided to match them up. Why was this such a good thing for their careers? Well, because they quickly learned that they had excellent chemistry together, and so used it to take themselves to the next level. Sadly though, tag team wrestling in WCW was always going to have an upper limit, and that was why, no matter how over they got in their new role, there was always going to be a ceiling involved. Luckily, the singles division had no such ceiling, however, and that was why, once the pair were broken up in October of 1993, they were able to go to places they never could have imagined ahead of time. Obviously for Austin in particular, this meant the absolute apex of the industry, as from 1997 onwards, he was the hottest thing in wrestling. Someone so over, he dragged everyone around him into a new boom period of popularity. And while Brian Pillman never reached quite the same heights by himself, that's not to say he wasn't hugely important in his own way as his loose cannon character, a character which shattered the line between kayfabe and reality, was so influential, people are still heavily cribbing from it today. In fact, you could argue the likes of CM Punk's pipe bomb in 2011 might never have happened had it not been for the groundwork the Ohio native was laying for such things back in the 90s. Sadly though, Pillman never got to live long enough to see the true depths of his influence, as he'd die in October of 1997 of a heart attack. But at least he lives on in his son, current NXT star Lexis King. And if we've learned anything over the years, it's that NXT can be a great place for someone to develop, whether that be as a tag team or a solo act, something evident in the saga of DIY during the mid-2010s. Yes, perhaps the greatest story the Black and Gold brand has ever told, the rise and fall of DIY had audiences gripped back during the glory days of NXT, as it was everything people had been begging for in a great angle under the WWE banner for years. After all, it featured friendship, betrayal, and revenge in spades. So what wasn't there to love? And it also allowed each man involved, Johnny Gargano and Tommaso Ciampa, to enter the next phases of their careers. As well, they had been successful as a double act, so successful they became NXT Tag Team Champions together at one point. Once they separated, they went on to have one of the greatest programs in modern history, with this one seeing each man hold the developmental brand's world title before it was all said and done. In fact, Ciampa would have held the top prize on 2 separate occasions by the time his run on NXT was over, showing just how good of a thing the split was for him in the long run. And while he'd only win the big one once, Gargano successfully offset this by becoming a record 3-time North American champion. Then, as if that weren't enough, once Triple H took over as head of creative, each man would be called up to the main roster, where they continue to ply their craft to this day on Raw. And sure, they might not have reached the same heights as they did on Tuesday nights yet, but give them time, as they're still only getting started, and who knows what the future will hold. Will it see them revive their legendary rivalry all over again for a new audience? It's entirely possible, just as it's also possible they'll each win some main roster gold in the not too distant future. But then they wouldn't be the first to do such a thing, because the template for finding success as a team on the third brand, then going it solo on the main roster thereafter, was already created years ago back in the late 2000s when The Miz and John Morrison were a thing. That's right, we've come to the part of the video where we once again argue that The Miz does not, in fact, suck. Rather, he's actually quite underrated. No, he isn't Bryan Danielson in the ring, and he never will be. But if you look at the WWE roster over the last couple of decades, you'll be hard-pressed to find a more reliable all-rounder who can fit into any role Vince McMahon asks of him and do it without complaining. Then, when it comes to John Morrison, you're talking about a guy who has such an eye-catching offensive style, such a crowd-pleasing manner, that it's impossible not to turn your attention towards him whenever he's on screen. And that's why he's had plenty of solo successes of his own over the years, including runs with the top prize in the likes of WWE CW, Impact, AAA, and Lucha Underground. Would this have happened if they hadn't first pooled the resources by teaming up together for a while? That's impossible to say. But we can say for sure that their time as a duo certainly helped them in the long run, as it allowed them an opportunity to develop their acts with the safety of knowing they had someone else to fall back on if things bombed. And because of that, once they went their separate ways in 2011, there was no more fear of bombing, as each man knew they had it in them to reach the stars, and boy did they ever do this. In the case of The Miz in particular, in fact, he'd actually win the WWE title later that same year, with this only being his first of 2 reigns with that particular belt. And while John Morrison may never have reached the same heights in WWE, as we mentioned a moment ago, he's certainly been no stranger to collecting world titles in other parts of the world. Even today, the pair still hold spots on the rosters of the 2 biggest wrestling companies in North America, with The Miz continuing to be a presence in WWE, and Morrison now working alongside his wife Taya Valkyrie in AEW. Does this mean we'll never see them together again? Maybe, but given how successful they were after their first split, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Just as it wasn't a bad thing when our next subjects chose to never reunite after they parted ways in 1989. Who are we talking about this time? Who else but Strikeforce? Don't remember Strikeforce off the top of your head? We wouldn't blame you if you didn't, because their run together stretches all the way back to the days of Golden Era WWF, an eternity ago in wrestling terms. And it was during this period that, while the roster was arguably never more stacked with star power in the singles division, Tito Santana and Rick Martel attempted to stand out by instead pairing up for a while. As time went on, however, it became clear each man had aspirations of being a single star, and this is what ultimately led to them breaking up in 1989 after Martel turned heel on his partner. But then maybe this was a good thing in the long run, as far as both parties were concerned, because once they were on their own, each found that they had it in them to be as single stars in New York all along, with Tito Santana going on to become a 2-time Intercontinental Champion and 1-time King of the Ring, and Rick Martel morphing into the Model, one of the best heels of the late Golden Era period. Of course, it really shouldn't have come as a surprise that they had this in them though, especially in the case of Martel, as prior to joining WWF, he'd already been an AWA World Champion. That said, just being a great wrestler wasn't enough in itself to get you over in the 80s WWF, and so that's why he first had to find his character with Santana before he could reach the next level. And that character ended up carrying him all the way into the early 90s, as he got to have feuds with the likes of Shawn Michaels right at the time as his former tag partner was continuing to go strong in the new gimmick of El Matador for a while, a gimmick which would help him to ultimately get a WWE Hall of Fame inclusion in 2004. But Strikeforce weren't the only great team of this era who went on to have even more success after they split, because at around the same time, another pair were going through something similar, and that's the US Express. Who were the US Express? Well, they were the duo made up of real-life brothers-in-law Barry Windham and Mike Rotunda, and as a duo, they were able to dominate the tag division prior to even making it to WWF, as before this, they were actually 3-time NWA United States Tag Team Champions in Championship Wrestling from Florida. Then, once they made the jump over to Vince McMahon's company, they got to have some excellent feuds against the likes of the North-South Connection, the Dream Team, and the Iron Sheik and Nikolai Volkov, all while winning that company's tag team belts on 2 separate occasions. Still though, the real upper limits of their success wouldn't become apparent until after they decided to call it a day in 1987 while working for Bill Watts' Universal Wrestling Federation, as at this point, each would make their mark as a single star. And for Barry Windham in particular, this meant eventually reaching the mountaintop in 1993 when he became NWA World's Champion. Did Mike Rotunda manage to achieve this too? No. But he would get to have a great run post-US Express regardless, as after spending a short spell in WCW, he'd move back over to the WWF where he'd begin playing the character of Irwin R. Shyster, wrestling's resident taxman and tag team partner to the Million Dollar Man, Ted DiBiase. Yes, while he never became a world champion as a solo act, Rotunda did become a tag team champion all over again on 3 separate occasions with DiBiase, proving he got a lot out of the US Express's split too. And even if he is still waiting on joining Windham in the WWE Hall of Fame, he can rest easy knowing that, as the father not only to Bo Dallas, but the late great Bray Wyatt, he was responsible for giving the world one of the biggest stars of the modern era, someone who captured fans' attention in a way few others could while he was still alive. That said, for as big of an impact as the US Express have had on the wrestling industry as a whole, they're not the last team from the 80s we're going to be looking at today. No, our next subjects came from that time period too. And while they did have success together, no one really remembers the Blade Runners for that now, because their solo careers have since overshadowed this part of their careers so much. Not sure who the Blade Runners are? Well, maybe you'll recognize them by their individual names, Steve Borden and Jim Hellwig. That's right, the 2 men we're talking about here are the same 2 men who would go on to become Sting and the Ultimate Warrior. And given how seismic they were for their respective companies at WCW and WWE during the late 80s and early 90s, their breakup and subsequent choice to go it alone as solo acts has to rank as one of the best decisions ever made in pro wrestling. After all, while they were certainly able to make their presence felt as a duo back in the mid-80s when they tagged in both the Continental Wrestling Association and Mid-South Wrestling, the success they had there was nothing compared to what would await them, and that's because just a few years later, there was a point in the summer of 1990 when it looked like they were going to become the dominant 2 solo acts in the business for the coming decade, as Sting was the NWA World Champion in WCW, and the Ultimate Warrior was the World Champion over in the WWF. Sure, Jim Hellwig may have flamed out soon after this, but none of that takes away from the fact that he was able to make it to the top of the wrestling world, even if it was only for a brief time. And when it comes to his former tag team partner, well, he had no issues staying in the main event scene even after his run as world champion came to an end, because over the course of the rest of his career, he'd remain such a big star, he'd win a total of 12 world titles across Jim Crockett Promotions, WCW, and TNA. Hell, even to this day, he's still an active performer for AEW. And with his upcoming retirement coming at March 3rd, 2024's Revolution pay-per-view, he'll no doubt continue to be one of the most talked about people in the industry next year too. Really, you could argue that no other team has seen their respective members go on to have the levels of success the Blade Runners did after they split up. But then it's not all about winning multiple world titles, of course. No, sometimes the optimum thing which can come from a tag team split is that a performer gets a chance to remind people that they can be a great singles act. And this is what happened to both Bobby Roode and James Storm when Beer Money Inc. parted ways in 2011. Yes, we're venturing back over to the Impact Zone now, as this is where one of the best teams of the late 2000s and 2010s made their name. And that team first came about when solo acts Rude and Storm decided to join forces in 2008 over their shared love of two things: beer and money. What followed on from there then was magic, as over the next 3 years, Beer Money Inc. became 4-time tag team champions in the then Nashville-based company. At a certain point, however, even all the success they were having together wasn't enough. And so this was why they'd end up going their own separate ways once more in the autumn of 2011, with them at this point feuding over the TNA World title. And once that feud was over and both men were free to go their own separate ways again, they found themselves even bigger solo stars than they had been before. In fact, from 2011 to the present day, they've won a total of 4 world titles between them across Impact and NXT. But then that's what happens whenever a tag team has a successful split. They go on to even greater things than they ever could have if they were still together. Sometimes in wrestling, you can figure out what's going to happen next from a mile away. After all, we all knew when Hulk Hogan or John Cena would find a way to overcome the odds and stand tall by the end, or that Vince McMahon and any other number of authority figures would eventually get their comeuppance. But what happens when the story takes a twist that surprises us? Well, while we've looked at some of the worst examples of this over on a previous video on this channel, there have been plenty of great examples too. So join us today as we take a deep dive into the best of them in What a Twist! Wrestling's Greatest Swerves. And where better to start than with one of the greatest swerves of the modern era? Because after 6 years of speculating about whether or not someone would ever have the guts to do it, Seth Rollins finally became the first person to cash in the Money in the Bank contract during the main event of WrestleMania. Of course, this one would take place at WrestleMania 31 on March 25th, 2015 during a match where, on the face of it, it seemed like the WWE was in a no-win situation. And that's because on one side of the existing main event you had Roman Reigns, someone who was being primed to be the new face of the company, but who was being wildly rejected by the audience. Meanwhile, on the other side you had Brock Lesnar, the biggest heel in WWE and someone who had beaten just about everyone by that point. So perhaps realizing that neither man coming out the victor would send fans home happy, Vince McMahon decided to make a last-minute decision on the day of the event by having Rollins use the Money in the Bank contract he'd won some months prior to intervene. Yes, as the bout was coming to its close, Seth, who was at this point closely aligned with the Authority, after having turned his back on his Shield brothers earlier in the year, would run to the ring to a massive pop as fans finally realized the moment they'd been waiting for ever since the concept was first introduced was finally happening. Just a few minutes later then, and in what JBL would subsequently dub the heist of the century, the Architect had pinned his former stablemate and was at the top of the entrance ramp swinging the WWE title over his head in celebration. Yes, even if he was a heel that night, the fact that he'd successfully cashed in was enough to send every fan home feeling like they'd seen something special. But it wasn't the first time a cash-in had surprised people, of course, because years prior to that, the first ever Money in the Bank contract holder, Edge, would set the template for this when he staked his claim at John Cena. Of course, at the time, this was a new concept to fans, and so it wasn't even clear how the contract cash-in would work at all until the moment it happened. Sure, everyone knew it granted the holder a title shot at the time of their choosing, but as far as most were concerned, this would mean booking a match and giving the existing champ an opportunity to prepare. So once Big Match John had spent almost half an hour surviving a grueling Elimination Chamber defense against Shawn Michaels, Kane, Kurt Angle, Carlito, and Chris Masters at January 8th, 2006's New Year's Revolution, he'd assume he was done for the night. Little did he know, however, that as he was sitting in the ring recovering, Vince McMahon would come out at the top of the entranceway, with him there announcing that Edge had decided that this was the best time to cash in his contract, and that the match would be taking place right there and now. Yes, living up to the nickname which would later be bestowed upon him, the Ultimate Opportunist chose his moment perfectly here. And that was why, with Cena barely able to defend himself anymore, less than 2 minutes later, he'd have lost the WWE title. Needless to say then, from there, Edge would become an instant main eventer, a position he continued to hold for the rest of his career thereafter. And what's more than that, this whole moment would solidify the Money in the Bank contract as being one of the most exciting things WWE had in their arsenal too, a gimmick so popular it's been used every year since. Yes, now that Edge had established it, the ability for a title to change hands could come at any time, as long as the challenger had that elusive briefcase that was. So from there, every year fans would wait patiently to see when the holder was going to cash it in, always wondering if that night would be the one. But while they were always on the lookout for this, one thing fans certainly weren't watching out for in 2014 was the breakup of the most popular stable the company had seen in years. That's right, we alluded to it earlier, but given how big and how successful a swerve it was, the night Seth Rollins turned on the Shield really deserves its own entry. How did we get there, though? After all, with them seemingly having a brotherly bond which could not be broken, the Hounds of Justice had been able to make WWE their own personal playground over the year prior to this. In fact, during this time, they'd gone from hated heels to beloved babyfaces, all while beating just about everyone the company had thrown at them, with the names they'd gone through including the likes of John Cena, Randy Orton, and Daniel Bryan. That said, their biggest challenge yet would come in the spring of 2014, as it was then that Evolution would reform, with them at this point setting their sights on ridding the company of the Shield once and for all. So that was why 2 six-man tags would take place between the groups over the next couple of months, with Rollins, Reigns, and Dean Ambrose ending up winning both of these. Still though, always having a plan B in his back pocket, Triple H would get in the ear of Seth at this point, convincing him that if he split away from his Shield brothers and joined up with the heels, there would be far more opportunities for him. And choosing to believe this then, the former Ring of Honor World Champion would lay out Reigns and Ambrose with a steel chair on the June 2nd episode of Raw, all while his new boss, The Game, watched on in glee. Yes, from this point onwards, much to fans' dismay, the Architect would become the crown jewel in the Authority's crown. But that didn't mean that his now former stablemates were done with him because, looking for revenge, Dean Ambrose would spend the rest of the summer feuding with Rollins, seeking justice not only for what he'd taken away from his brothers, but also from the fans too. And of course, karma would eventually catch up to the betrayer here, though when it finally did so, it wouldn't be in the way that he or fans initially imagined. And that's because after going on a very successful run over the next couple of years and becoming a multiple-time WWE champion in the process, the architect of the Shield's downfall would be betrayed himself by none other than Triple H. What was the reason for this? Well, by the August 22nd, 2016 episode of Raw, following Seth's loss to Finn Balor at SummerSlam the night prior, the Game decided he'd milked just about everything he could from Rollins, with him at this point deciding to pick a new guy in the form of Kevin Owens. So that was how, after Balor had to immediately relinquish his newly won Universal title as a result of an injury, a 4-way match would be booked to crown a new champion, one which would include Roman Reigns, Big Cass, Kevin Owens, and of course, Seth Rollins. But while he may have thought his boss was going to help him come away from this one with the win, both the Architect and everyone else in the audience would be surprised when Triple H delivered a pedigree towards him at the close of the bout and instructed KO to pick up the win and the title instead. So after that, now shifting to the side of the babyfaces again, Rollins would begin an 8-month odyssey, one which eventually saw him get his hands on the Game at WrestleMania 34, and finally defeat him one-on-one. Of course, this was a bittersweet win for him though, as it meant losing a mentor in the process. But while that WrestleMania may have marked an important turning point in his career, it was nothing compared to the shift which had taken place for The Undertaker 4 years prior when, to the shock of absolutely everyone, the famed streak would finally come to an end. That's right, ever since his first match at the Showcase of the Immortals in 1991, there had been one constant in WWE, and that was, no matter what, The Undertaker's arm would be raised by the time WrestleMania was over. Even after Hogan had quit, even after Austin had retired, and The Rock had gone to Hollywood, the Dead Man would remain as the eternal figure of the company, always getting the victory at the biggest show of the year, no matter who he was going up against. That said, as has been well documented by this point, the first decade or so of his WrestleMania win streak was more coincidence than anything else, with it not being until the early 2000s that someone first mentioned to Mark Calloway that he had a special thing going on. So following the announcement of his match with Randy Orton at WrestleMania 21 in 2005, the streak would become an annual highlight of the show, with a new hungry challenger stepping up each and every year, hoping to be the one to finally slay the dragon. And while there were some close calls for the Dead Man throughout this period, at a certain point, with him having beaten the best of the best and getting closer and closer to retirement, it was assumed by many that he would never lose and that his undefeated WrestleMania streak would be his ultimate legacy. Of course, there was one man who had something to say about this, and that man was none other than the 3-time WWE champion and 1-time UFC heavyweight champion, Brock Lesnar. Yes, after taking a lengthy sabbatical from wrestling to go conquer the world of MMA, the Beast would return to WWE in 2012 with an all-new aura of being an unstoppable killer emanating from him. Still though, even if this was Brock 2.0, few actually believed he would beat The Undertaker by the time their long-awaited match came about at WrestleMania 30 on April 6, 2014. After all, if anyone was going to end the streak, then it had always been assumed it would be a younger, up-and-coming star who needed the help to get to the next level. So when the bell rang and Lesnar quickly began to dominate then, fans may have been somewhat surprised, but still, they were still confident the result would come out okay in the end. That was until the Beast hit 3 F5s on his opponent and, to the absolute shock of everyone both in attendance and watching at home, pinned the dead man in the middle of the ring 1, 2, 3. Yes, it's since been called WWE's Red Wedding on account of how wild a moment it was, with the entire crowd of over 75,000 people being left unable to speak for the first few minutes after it happened. Many, in fact, assumed it was a mistake at first, with it not being until a graphic came up on the big screen reading 21-1 that it became clear that this was all part of the plan. So at this point, it started to sink in that the streak was over, and that The Undertaker himself was mortal, a tough thing to accept for those who had grown up watching wrestling and having this be a comfort they could expect to see every year. But if that was the biggest shocker for those generation of fans, for the generation prior to Mark Calloway's debut with WWE, the biggest swerve was something entirely different, but no less seismic. And that was the time where, after having held on to the WWF title for 1,474 days, Hulk Hogan would finally be beaten by Andre the Giant. Of course, the reason this one was so shocking wasn't just because it was the Hulkster losing. No, it was the circumstances around it, because as it happened, it would all involve the $1 Million Man, plastic surgery, and 2 twin referees. That's right, following Hogan and Andre's generation-defining showdown at WrestleMania 3, the rematch of the century would be booked for February 5th, 1988's The Main Event. And with the anticipation being higher than ever for this one then, a staggering 33 million Americans would tune in to watch, the highest TV ratings any wrestling show has ever gotten before, and likely will ever get in the future at this point. But while most expected to see another successful Hulk title defense here, they'd ultimately be swerved, because at the end of the bout, as Andre was pinning the champ, the referee would count the 3, despite Hogan's shoulders not being down. Needless to say then, fans were immediately aware a screwjob had taken place, and soon after this, they'd realize it had been Ted DiBiase behind it all along, as after the Giant was given the title, he'd then sell it to the $1 Million Man. Yes, enacting his plan perfectly, DiBiase would reveal here that he'd replaced the original referee, Dave Hebner, with an evil version who had been given plastic surgery so as to make him look like an exact doppelganger. Of course, in reality though, this doppelganger was actually Dave's twin brother Earl, with this being the moment he was first introduced to WWF fans. But while the kayfabe plot had been successful in getting the belt off of Hogan, then on-screen company president Jack Tunney would not let the whole thing stand for long, as pretty quickly afterwards, he'd strip DiBiase of the title and create a one-night tournament to crown a new champion. And this tournament would ultimately end up taking place at WrestleMania 4, with Macho Man Randy Savage coming out of that night as the new champ. Of course, this would also directly lead into the Mega Powers storyline, still one of the most successful in WWF history to this day. In fact, so successful was it, the company were still able to largely live off the fumes of it well into the early 90s, as with there not really being much else going on that was drawing in fans in large numbers at that point, they'd have to rely on nostalgia instead. That said, it would be a period which almost gave one of the better swerves of the era. And this was because it was in June of 1995 when the roadie was supposed to be revealed as the one singing Jeff Jarrett's With My Baby Tonight all along. And we say almost, because while this one had been teased for months prior, both men would ultimately quit the company before the whole thing could climax. Of course, had it gone as it was originally supposed to, Double J, who had been regularly claiming that he was the best country musician WWE had ever seen at this point, would have been embarrassed when an accidental curtain slip showed audiences he was just lip-syncing his hit single, and that his assistant was the one really behind the vocals. From there then, the two would have feuded with each other for a while, with the by now babyface roadie presumably coming out on top come the end of things. But if this never actually happened on screen, we hear you ask, then why is it included in this video? Well, that's because eventually it was revealed on screen. That's right, When the roadie returned to the company the following year, now working under the name of Road Dogg Jesse James, he'd immediately turn himself babyface by announcing that it had in fact been him who was singing Jarrett's song all along. That said, this wouldn't be enough to get him anywhere higher than the lower card for the immediate future. No, that rise wouldn't actually start until he began teaming up with current scissor enthusiast Billy Gunn in 1997, with the two at this point calling themselves the New Age Outlaws and going on to become one of the highlights of the Attitude Era. And it's during the Attitude Era that our next great swerve took place too, as it happened, because after spending his first months in WWF as a hated heel, only to then get massively over as the cocky People's Champion, no one saw it coming when The Rock decided to turn back to the dark side and join up with the corporation. But how could they? After all, as we said, at this point the Great One had only just turned babyface, and with his popularity growing to the point where it was threatening to eclipse even that of Stone Cold Steve Austin, it seemed like a crazy idea on the face of it. So when the WWF title was vacated in late 1998 then, with a new champion to be decided at that November Survivor Series Deadly Games tournament, it seemed like the only two options to win were the Rattlesnake or The Rock. And while fans were happy to have either one come out on top, none of them expected it to go down the way it did when, after Austin was eliminated in the semifinals, the People's Champion would turn on the people by aligning with Vince McMahon in the final, using this to help him beat Mankind. So from there, now rebranding himself as the corporate champion, The Rock would deny his fans what they wanted out of him each and every week, playing his role to perfection here as he stood as the final roadblock for Stone Cold to eventually overcome. Sure, given how popular he was, this heel turn was always going to have an expiration date on it, but that didn't make it any less impactful when it happened, and any less worthy of being the closing moment to Vince Russo's finest hour as a booker. But while this represented a rare successful swerve from Russo, he unfortunately can't take any of the credit for our next entry, and that's because by the time 2002 rolled around, he'd be long gone. So when hell froze over and Eric Bischoff joined WWE, it would be all Vince McMahon's idea. Of course, what an idea this was though, because given how bitter the Monday Night Wars had gotten towards the end, there was absolutely no one who believed Eazy-E had any chance of showing up in a WWE ring at that point in time. After all, he'd actively tried to put the company out of business, and even gone as far as to regularly give away the results of their show on his own TV. Still, ever the businessman, McMahon was able to look past this and see money in the idea of taking his most hated enemy and turning him into a co-worker. And so it was then that on the July 16th episode of Raw that year, just after he'd pulled the plug on the NWO once and for all, the boss would announce that he was appointing a new general manager in charge of the Red brand. Then, just seconds after that, it would be revealed that Bischoff himself was the general manager, with this leading to a sight most fans thought they would never see, as he and McMahon embraced each other on the top of the ramp. Seriously, if you were a wrestling fan during the late 90s, this was the equivalent of having Batman and the Joker suddenly become best friends. So needless to say then, everyone watching was shocked, and they were even more shocked as the weeks went on and it became apparent that Bischoff was not going anywhere. But for as shocking as that may have been, there's another swerve that's even better and may go down as the greatest of all time. Yes, we're talking about the time Mark Henry faked his retirement and proved that, despite what his naysayers might have you believe, he really was that great. But for some context here, by the time 2013 rolled around, the world's strongest man had spent almost 2 decades on the WWE roster. And while he'd been a regular fixture on TV throughout this period, the general consensus was that he'd largely failed to live up to the expectations that were set for him as the world's strongest man. Sure, he'd had a successful run as World Heavyweight Champion with his Hall of Pain gimmick in 2011 and 2012, but after that, it was assumed he had nothing else left in the tank. So when he came out on the June 17th episode of Raw to announce his retirement from the ring then, most people took it at face value. And as he stood there in a now famous salmon jacket, all while John Cena was on the ring apron, the fans in attendance showered him with all the love and adoration that was to be expected for any popular figure who was deciding to call it a day. Of course, what they didn't expect was that, after delivering a speech for the ages that proved he was a far better orator than most had given him credit for, he'd immediately swerve everyone by body slamming Big Match John, and revealing that not only was he not going anywhere, but he was coming for the title. Yes, no one saw this coming, and in the end, that's what made it so special. In fact, at this point, it's probably going to go down as the most memorable part of Mark Henry's career overall, and helped to ensure that the inductor of the Hall of Pain ended up in its rightful. Hardcore wrestling has long been one of the most attention-grabbing styles, as it involves taking things to another level of brutality altogether, so it should come as no surprise that many performers have chosen to specialize in this genre over the years then. But just who are the best hardcore wrestlers in history? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now, starting with Mick Foley. Yes, if you were to ask most wrestling fans the first name that came to mind when they thought about hardcore wrestling, it would likely be Mick Foley. And that's because during wrestling's biggest boom period at the turn of the millennium, he was the man known as the hardcore legend. Why was he given this moniker? Well, because throughout his career, he displayed an uncanny ability to push things to all new levels. It didn't matter if it was his run in WCW as Cactus Jack, where he and Vader just about murdered each other across a series of bouts, or his time spent under the same gimmick in ECW, where he fully lived up to the extreme name of that company. Every time Mick hit the ring back then, you could be assured you were going to see something crazy. And that's not even getting into the wildness of his time spent out in Japan, where in 1995 he became the IWA King of the Deathmatch, with this being what initially put his name on the map at all on a worldwide scale. That said, for as crazy as things got in other places, Foley's wildest hardcore moments arguably came in the WWF after he joined that promotion in the mid-90s. And this is because it was here that while working under the guise of Mankind, he'd give us two of the most extreme moments ever seen inside of a wrestling ring. The first of which came when he wrestled The Undertaker at King of the Ring 1998 inside of Hell in a Cell, and just about killed himself in the process. That's right, after taking a terrifying bump off the top of the cage, and then another straight through the roof, the match would start and Mick would spend the next 15 minutes or so continuing to put his body through insane punishment. And the thing is, that might not even be his most hardcore moment in the WWF. No, this might be the time he fought The Rock at the Royal Rumble in 1999, and in a scene which was largely seen as too much for even bloodthirsty Attitude Era audiences of the time, took a staggering 11 unprotected chair shots to the head. Needless to say then, it wouldn't be long after this before Mrs. Foley's baby boy decided to hang up his boots. And nothing of that level of gruesomeness would ever be allowed inside of a WWF ring again. But one place that level of savageness was still being allowed was over in Extreme Championship Wrestling, the same place our next subject made his name, the Sandman. Yes, the Sandman's vibe was very much that of a guy who just got off his job as a long-haul trucker and had gotten into a bar fight while pounding a few beers. And that's exactly what made him such a great hardcore brawler, as to watch him tussle with his coworkers over in Philly in such a scrappy manner was like watching someone take part in a real fight at times. As you can imagine then, this made him a big hit with the Philadelphia faithful, and it even led to him becoming world champion there on 5 separate occasions. Of course, it's not really those title reigns most people remember him for today, though. No, it's the wild hardcore moments he was part of. Moments like the time he was apparently blinded by someone we'll get to in a moment, causing him to have to feign retirement. And then there was the time he was quite literally crucified at the ringside area during ECW High Incident in October 1996, a crazy moment to say the least, and one which only went further towards establishing Paul Heyman's promotion as being an outlaw one where anything and everything could happen. Very few wrestlers would have put themselves in that situation, but the Sandman did, because he was just that hardcore. Yes, one of James Fullington's favorite things prior to a match was to walk out to enter Sandman while he pounded a few beers, meaning that by the time the bell had rung, he no doubt already had a bit of a buzz going on. Of course, the Sandman wasn't the only hardcore legend of ECW who's earned a spot in today's video, though. No, there were plenty of others who were eligible for that role too. And one of them is our next subject, the man who we alluded to a moment ago that once crucified the Sandman, the man known as Raven. That's right, we had to include Raven in this video because he was so synonymous with hardcore wrestling back during the turn of the millennium period. After all, throughout his run in ECW, he was a part of some of the most brutal moments that promotion was ever a part of. And if we are talking about feuds which defined Extreme Championship Wrestling, then his years-long odyssey with Tommy Dreamer has to be right at the top of the list, as it's one of the greatest feuds of all time. But it wasn't just his ECW run which made Raven such a hardcore legend, as he'd take his act to other places and make a name for himself there too. Yes, we're talking about his time in WCW, where he was revealed to be a spoiled rich kid, his time in TNA, where he's settled into more of a Legends role, or most prominently his time in WWF during the Attitude Era. Why was his run in WWF the most prominent of his non-ECW work? Well, because it was there he became a mainstay of the promotion's hardcore division, winning that belt a record 26 times before all was said and done, and even carrying it into WrestleMania 17, where he had an incredible three-way bout with The Big Show and Kane. That's right, Scott Levy was able to carve out a place for himself in WWF, and being able to carve out a place for himself wherever he goes is a skill he's continued to use right up until the present day, as while he might not be a full-time performer anymore, he's still been known to show up at a local indie here and there where he can remind everyone exactly what makes him so hardcore. Not bad for a man whose first notable character was that of backstage interviewer and manager Johnny Polo, and all he had to do in order to do so was to tap into that violent side of himself, the one which wanted to show the world just how dangerous he could be when given a chance. But what of that great career rival of his who we talked about a moment ago? Doesn't he deserve a mention in this video too, for both his feud with Raven and for everything else he did? Why, yes he does. So let's talk about him now then, the man who blinded the Sandman, a man so hardcore they called him the innovator of violence, Tommy Dreamer. Of course, Tommy Dreamer didn't start off this way though. No, believe it or not, during his early days as a wrestler, he was considered a little bit too much of a pretty boy to be taken seriously by the ECW audience. That would all change, however, when in 1994, he got into a feud with the Sandman, one which culminated in a Singapore cane match. What was the stipulation of this one? Well, it was that the loser would have to take 10 lashes to the back with a cane, and there's no way to fake that. So when Dreamer lost and took his lumps then, it earned him a whole lot of respect with the audience as they realized he really was a tough guy. And that would catapult him toward the level of being the spiritual face of the entire promotion. Yes, whenever Tommy Dreamer showed up to take part in one of Extreme Championship Wrestling's trademark wild brawls, he'd always have the fans behind him, whether he was chasing the ECW World title, protecting his wife Beulah McGillicuddy, or engaging in a lengthy program with Raven. That's right, in what was the original version of Cody Rhodes finishing the story, the multi-year-long arc of Tommy Dreamer trying to score a win over his greatest rival served as the backbone to ECW throughout the mid-90s. So when on Raven's last night with the company in 1997, Tommy finally got the better of him, it felt like a truly cathartic moment. But that wouldn't be the end of his career. No, he'd continue on for a while yet, even after ECW went under in early 2001, and he'd do that in places like WWE. Sure, the innovator of violence would never be as big a star in WWE as he had been prior, but he would carve out a nice role for himself in their hardcore division, with this allowing him to play to his strengths as a brawler. And after his time there came to an end, Tommy would move on to pastures new like TNA. Hell, he'd even start his own indie promotion at one point, House of Hardcore. So if we're talking about people who maintain that punk rock attitude when it comes to hardcore wrestling, Tommy Dreamer is most certainly one of them. But he's not the craziest person to ever come out of an ECW ring. No, that honor has to go to our next subject, New Jack. Okay, where do we start with New Jack? One of the wildest wrestlers to ever set foot inside of a ring. Yes, he was never going to give you a technical classic on the level of a Bryan Danielson or a Bret Hart, but what he was going to do was bring a sense of complete chaos to the proceedings whenever he showed up. Why was this? Well, because there was a real sense that anything could happen whenever he was there. After all, it was him who was responsible for the infamous mass transit incident in 1996 when he really hurt an untrained young wrestler. And it was him who was responsible for the bump Vic Grimes took off the scaffolding at an XPW show in 2002. Yes, some of the craziest moments in wrestling history can be attributed to New Jack, and this was exactly why he found it so hard to get booked after a while. Sure, Paul Heyman would always use him when he could, as there was such an aura of danger around the man, it never failed to draw in a crowd. But with certain states banning him from performing following the mass transit incident, the chances to use New Jack became more limited. Still, this only meant that when he did show up with a trolley full of weapons, it felt like a true event as he beat up everyone in the ring, all while the sounds of Ice Cube's natural-born killers blared out of the arena's loudspeakers throughout. That said, it did mean Heyman was never going to be able to do anything like put a world title on New Jack, and it also meant that when ECW went under in 2001, there was no way WWF was ever going to go anywhere near the North Carolinian. No, from the 2000s onwards, Jerome Young would have to settle for being a legend of the indie circuit, as he mostly showed up in local promotions here and there for a payday. Yes, it is true that he got a couple of shots in TNA, but these were never destined to be long-term. And even with the ECW nostalgia that WWE have leaned into in recent years, prior to his passing in 2021, they never brought in New Jack. Yes, they knew all too well what his reputation was and what he'd be liable to do if someone gave him a steel chair or a scaffolding to climb. Now, it's probably for the best that New Jack stayed away from the big leagues during his final years, as it allowed his legend as the ultimate renegade to continue to grow. The legend of perhaps the most hardcore man the North American scene has ever seen or ever will see. Well, at least in the modern day anyway, because if we head back to the territory era, we'll find someone else who might be able to challenge him for that role. Who are we talking about here? Why, Abdullah the Butcher, of course. That's right, Abby was one of the wildest performers of all time, and this gave him quite a reputation as someone to be feared. In fact, whenever he arrived in a territory, it was guaranteed to draw a large crowd of fearful onlookers as they settled in to watch what was going to be a car crash inside of a wrestling ring. That said, should things spill outside of the ring, those same fans wouldn't waste time in fleeing if the Butcher came too close to them. But then maybe that was a good idea, because given how much punishment he would inflict upon opponents such as Big Cat Ernie Ladd, The Sheik, and the legendary Jumbo Tsuruta whenever they locked up, and given how much he fully lived the character, never breaking kayfabe for anyone, there was a real fear associated with Abdullah the Butcher. The kind of fear you just couldn't replicate nowadays with how much the veil of secrecy behind the industry has been lifted. The closest thing we could compare it to would be if fans could be led to believe a real fighter like Brock Lesnar or Bobby Lashley really had gone rogue and was about to attack members of the audience. And that's not even getting into the forks, a favorite of Abby's and one that he would often use to carve his opponents' foreheads open. But then to be fair, he was only too happy to allow the same thing to happen to him when the time came. And that's exactly why he had those scars in his forehead which were so deep he could legitimately balance a coin in them. All of this is to say that back during the territory days, there were few names which could inspire as much terror amongst fans as Abdullah the Butcher. But there was one other person who could approach that level of mayhem and create that much of a sense of terror whenever they arrived in front of a live crowd. Someone who did this in just about every continent in the world, wrestling's ultimate rebel, Bruiser Brody. That's right, Brody provided some of the greatest hardcore wrestling in existence. Stuff so good it still holds up to this day. But then what else would you expect from a man who took absolutely no nonsense from anyone at this point in his life? No, if you think people like CM Punk, Steve Austin, and Roddy Piper were rebellious during their day, you haven't seen anything yet. How did he do this? Well, by doing exactly what he wanted whenever he wanted to. And if that meant he took a dislike to his opponent that night and didn't want to sell for them, then so be it. Lex Luger found this out during one infamous steel cage match the pair had in 1987, and that was why he famously fled the ring before things could turn into a real fight. That's right, it was well known back then that so hardcore was Bruiser Brody, he was the last person you ever wanted to upset. But even if he could be a headache in this respect, he was so over with audiences on account of his wild man style, he continued to be booked in just about every territory there was. And that would lead to him having classic matches against a who's who of opponents at the time. We're talking about names like Bruno Sammartino, Antonio Inoki, and Abdullah the Butcher, all while he was also teaming up with the likes of Big John Studd and Stan Hansen. Sadly though, living the life of an outlaw would end up coming back to bite Frank Goodish, as it was what led to his untimely passing in 1988. What happened here? Well, it was while working in Puerto Rico for Invader 1, someone who Brody had gone through issues with in the past, that a backstage argument would lead to him being attacked in the showers and passing away right there. Yes, it was one of wrestling's most infamous moments, and something which is still talked about to this day. Yes, we'd have loved for Bruiser Brody to have lived on to become an elder statesman of hardcore wrestling into the 90s and beyond. Maybe even showing up for places like WWE and WCW and helping to raise the next generation up. It certainly wouldn't be unheard of for this to happen, as the same thing would end up happening with our next subject, the one, the only, Terry Funk. Yes, Terry Funk is one of the greatest wrestlers of all time, easily a performer who could be on anyone's top 10 list when it comes to greats of the ring. But while many today would consider him a legend of hardcore wrestling, the godfather of the genre in many ways, he wasn't always this kind of fighter. Now, back during his early years working on the territory circuit with his brother Dory Funk Jr., he had a reputation of being something of a technical maestro, a mat worker extraordinaire whose closest comparison today might be someone like a Chad Gable. Hell, so good was he at this part of his job, he was even able to become NWA World's Champion in 1975 when he beat Jack Briscoe for the honor. That said, as time went on and he saw the landscape of the industry changing, the Funkster was smart enough to know that he had to adapt, and that was what led him to join a then upstart promotion known as Eastern Championship Wrestling in 1993, and there tried to build up their company into something bigger. How would he do this? Well, by playing into their gimmick of going hardcore, something that got even worse when they transformed into Extreme Championship Wrestling soon thereafter. Luckily though, by this point, Terry was all too familiar with hardcore wrestling, as while out in Japan he'd made a name for himself with such a style, with him even taking part in that iconic King of the Deathmatch tournament, eventually won by Mick Foley. So despite by then being in his 40s, and old man in wrestling terms during that era, Funk was able to keep up with the rest of the roster and, in many ways, even exceed them as he completely transformed his character from technical wizard into that of a violent brawler who wasn't afraid to use any weapon given to him. And this all eventually led to him becoming ECW World Champion on 2 separate occasions. Of course, it wouldn't just be in ECW that he showed off this new hardcore style though. No, he also took his middle-aged and crazy gimmick over to both WCW and WWF, where he'd fit right in with the wild Crash TV stylings of the time. That's right, Terry Funk was awesome as a hardcore wrestler, arguably even better than he was a mat wrestler. And given how good he was at this, that's quite an achievement. But then when you're talking about Terry Funk, this level of range is to be expected, and it's part of what makes him such a legend. Hell, it would even allow him to last long enough to work for TNA briefly when he shared a locker room with our next subject, Abyss. That's right, it's time for us to venture back over to TNA, as it's there pretty much the entirety of Abyss's in-ring career played out. And that makes him one of the true pillars then, someone who remained with the promotion through thick and thin, like an Impact version of what The Undertaker was to WWE or what Sting was to WCW. It's not just that he was there for so long that made the DC native so popular with the TNA faithful though. No, it's also the fact that he was so willing to put his body on the line in some truly brutal hardcore matches. Really, even with all the former ECW talent who passed through the doors of Nashville over the years, there's probably no one more associated with being a hardcore performer there than Joseph Park. Hell, he even had a special match type made to satisfy his bloodlust, with that being the Monsters Ball match. What were the rules to this one? Well, they were basically that in kayfabe at least, everyone involved would be locked in a room without food or water for 24 hours before the bout took place, with this leaving them in a feral state and ready to commit unreasonable acts of violence once they hit the ring. Obviously then, Abyss took full advantage of these opportunities to cause chaos whenever they happened, with him often bringing out those trusty old tools of his like barbed wire and thumbtacks to help him get the job done. But then it wasn't just in Monsters Ball matches that he's shown. No, he was also known to get violent at other times too, even if it wasn't technically within the rules. Basically, as a visual mixture of both Kane and Mankind, he was carrying on the legacy of what those men were doing back during the late 90s in hardcore brawls, specifically Foley, who Abyss in many ways feels like a spiritual successor to. And this style of brawling and mayhem led to much title success for him during his lengthy run with TNA. In fact, between his debut in 2002 and his exit in 2019, he'd become a one-time world champion, one-time X Division champion, two-time television champion, three-time tag team champion, and a member of the 2018 Impact Hall of Fame class. Alas though, eventually all the punishment he'd put upon his body for all those years became too much for him to bear anymore, and so that was why he'd enter retirement as the 2020s dawned. Not that he'd leave the business entirely though. No, after signing on the dotted line with WWE in 2019 to take on a job as a behind-the-scenes agent, he'd be able to reunite with old friends like AJ Styles and Samoa Joe, all while even making the occasional on-screen cameo in backstage segments with the former. Two people he never got to share the screen with in WWE, however, are our next two subjects, as they were both gone by then. Who are we talking about this time? Who else but Hardcore and Crash, the Khali cousins. Yes, we are doing a 2-for-1 with this entry because, try as we might, we just couldn't separate these two. But then how could we when their careers are so closely intertwined with one another? Sure, it wasn't always that way, as early on in Hardcore Khali's run, back when he went by names like Hollywood Bob Holly down in Smoky Mountain Wrestling or Thurman Sparky Plug over in New Generation era WWF, he was more of a solo act. But after leaning into the hardcore division as the late 90s came around and changing his name to Hardcore Khali, the Alabama native realized it was better to have some people there to back him up. So that's what eventually led to the introduction of his kayfabe cousin Crash in 1998. Who was Crash? Well, he was basically the scrappy dude Bob Holly's Scooby, what with him only being a small guy who, in his own mind's eyes, thought he was a heavyweight. And that would soon lead him into the hardcore division with his cousin, where he proved to be so successful he'd pretty much become synonymous with the WWF version of the hardcore title. That's right, despite his older cousin literally having the word hardcore in his name, and despite Bob finding a lot of success himself in that division, so much so that he'd become a 6-time hardcore champion in his own right, it will always be Crash Holly people think of first when they think of the hardcore title. And that's because back at the turn of the millennium, when it was being defended under 24/7 rules, meaning anyone could challenge for it at any place at any time as long as they had a referee with them, he was usually the one holding it. Needless to say then, this led to a lot of crazy scenes as he was forced to defend his gold in places like a hotel room or a children's jungle gym, all while barely escaping by the skin of his teeth. Hell, there were times he'd even have to fight hardcore Holly in spaces like these. But no matter how much they fought and no matter how hardcore things got between them at points, they always remained family and so always had each other's backs when it counted. And that's the important thing at the end of the day, something which was brought into sharp focus when Crash passed away all too young in November of 2003 at just 32 years old. But even if he is gone now, he, along with his cousin and everyone else we've looked at today, remain amongst the biggest legends of hardcore wrestling, and people who can proudly say they all played a role in taking things to the extreme in a way that few others around them ever could. If you're a wrestling booker, one of the biggest problems you might have to deal with on a regular basis is the fact that everyone on your roster wants a push. And sure, many of them have a valid case when it comes to why they deserve this, but the reality remains, there's only so much time you'll have to devote to them each and every week. So that's where the juggling act of knowing who to elevate at what particular moment comes into play. And even if this only means giving them a mini push, at least it's something. But what are the most notable examples of these in wrestling history? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today. So join us as we take a deep dive into mini pushes, wrestling's short-lived shoves. And if we're going to start anywhere, we can't think of a better point than with a man who, while he may have gone on to become a main eventer and even world champion again later on in his career, only got to have a one-day reign with the top prize in 1998, and that's Kane. But why did the Big Red Machine only get 24 hours with this title back then? After all, this was arguably the point where his character was at its strongest, as still pretty much being unkillable in fans' eyes, he was believable as the Michael Myers-esque horror movie villain. Well, if you want an answer to that, you only have to look at who else was on the roster then, because 98 was far and away the year of Steve Austin. And with him being the focus then, it meant he'd hold the belt for the better part of the year. That said, there would be a brief interruption in his reign at June 28th's King of the Ring pay-per-view, because there he would go up against Kane in a First Blood match and ended up dropping the belt to him. Yes, well, this show is mostly remembered now for the Hell in a Cell bout earlier in the show, which saw Mick Foley take two of the most insane bumps in wrestling history. It was also the night where Glenn Jacobs briefly reached the top of the mountain after dethroning the biggest star in the entire industry. Of course, this would end up being short-lived though, as the next night on Raw, he'd drop it right back to Stone Cold in the rematch. And all that really begs the question, why do the title change at all then? Well, a couple of reasons as it happened. First of all, Vince Russo thought it would be a nice twist to get fans to continue tuning in so as to see what would happen next. On top of that, Kane was so massively over at this point that it felt like giving him a token run with the belt would be a nice reward for the good work he'd done in getting the character over as the best villain the company had seen since the early days of The Undertaker. And as it happened, a thank you for a job well done was also the reason that our next entrant got a one-day title run in 2016. That said, when it came to Zack Ryder, it would be the Intercontinental title belt he would win instead. Yes, Zack Ryder, the poster child for someone who had gotten over on their own merit and was then subsequently punished by management as a result. Of course, he's managed to rebuild his career somewhat since then by doing well on the indie circuit as Matt Cardona, but back in the early 2010s, he was briefly so over that he could have been a legitimate WWE main eventer. But given the fact that Vince McMahon had not masterminded this push himself, he felt the strange need to burn money and destroy this opportunity by squashing Ryder at every turn and killing his momentum stone dead. So pretty soon after this, Long Island Ice Z would return to the lower mid-card, where it was expected he would spend the remainder of his days wallowing in obscurity. That was until WrestleMania 32 on April 3, 2016, however, as it was there that, for one night, Ryder would return to prominence when he won a ladder match to become the new Intercontinental Champion. Sure, it was a moment which, for many, had come 5 years too late, but even still, it was something to show the company still believed in the perennial mid-carder. And even if Zack would end up dropping the belt back to The Miz the next night on Raw, at least he got to have that brief moment in the sun, with this ending up serving as an apology of sorts for the way he was fumbled back in 2011. Of course, sometimes a push being short-lived wasn't always what was in the original plans, though. No, sometimes it was meant to lead to something far greater, but had to be halted due to issues with the performer themselves. And if you want a perfect example of this in action, you need look no further than what happened with William Regal after he won the King of the Ring in 2008. Now, for modern fans who only know Regal as the general manager of NXT or the mentor to the Blackpool Combat Club, it's easy to forget that, while he was an active wrestler, he was amongst the greatest ever to lace up a pair of boots. In fact, you could make a solid argument that he's the best performer to ever do it who never went on to win a world title. That said, he almost did get to check this mark off his bucket list in 2008 because here, while he was in the middle of an excellent run as the heel GM of Raw, he'd book himself into the King of the Ring tournament and then go on to win the whole thing. After that, with him having both on-screen booking power and now the added confidence in knowing that he was still the best wrestler on the roster, his ego would only grow that much more as he became something of a megalomaniacal tyrant. Seriously, you could argue that, as an on-screen character, this period marked the highest highs the Englishman was ever able to reach, as week in and week out, he'd be one of the most entertaining parts of the show, ruling everything with an iron thumb and making life a living hell for anyone who crossed him. So over did he get during this time. In fact, there were even some initial plans to put the WWE title on him for a while. That said, these plans would have to be scrapped when Regal would fail a drug test and be suspended. This then would see Regal be pulled from TV in early 2009. However, since this time, Regal has gone on record to say that he hadn't broken the company's wellness policy and the drug test was an anomaly. Unfortunately, though, the damage had already been done in management's eyes as, following that, they would scrap his push and never trust him in a position of such prominence again. But at least he can take some solace in the fact that he's not the only member of the Blackpool Combat Club whose push to the WWE main event scene was short-lived. And that's because, a half-decade later in 2014, Cesaro would find out firsthand that being a Paul Heyman guy didn't necessarily mean you were going to stay at the top forever. Of course, it wasn't for fans' lack of desire to see this though, because for years prior, the Swiss Superman had been regarded as one of the best and most underutilized wrestlers in the world. And that was why they were so excited when, after winning the Andre the Giant Memorial Battle Royal at WrestleMania 30, he'd come out the next night on Raw to announce that he was the newest client of Paul Heyman. After all, if anyone could take someone to new heights, it was Heyman. You just had to look towards the likes of Brock Lesnar and CM Punk if you wanted evidence of that. Unfortunately for Cesaro, however, it soon became apparent that a similar trajectory just wasn't in the cards for him. No, instead, the decision to pair him up with the former ECW owner appeared to have been made so that Heyman could remain on TV every week and keep Brock Lesnar fresh in people's minds following his defeat of The Undertaker at the Showcase of the Immortals. So as the months went on, Cesaro's push would flounder as he increasingly became a background character in his own story. And this would foster a resentment within him which saw him spend the next decade determined to prove that he could grab that ever-elusive brass ring even if Vince McMahon had no intention of offering it. Of course, he would eventually have to go over to All Elite Wrestling to achieve this, and he's not alone in that either, because just a couple of years prior, Brody Lee had done the same. That said, he almost never had to do this at all, because in 2017, when he was still working for WWE as Luke Harper, he got a brief push of his own which many felt would finally see him reach the next level. That's right, after spending the prior 5 years largely being a background character in the Wyatt family story, Harper finally got a chance to shine when someone in management realized he had all the tools required to become a modern-day Bruiser Brody. And so a push would begin to present itself for him soon thereafter when, upon Randy Orton seemingly joining forces with the Wyatts in late 2016, the big man began acting suspicious of the new recruit, believing him to be a mole trying to destroy them from the inside. But while he would eventually be proven right in this suspicion, he wasn't able to convince its leader, Bray Wyatt, at the time. No, in fact, in early 2017, after Harper and Orton had gone one-on-one during an episode of SmackDown, Bray would side with the Viper to the point that he'd actually deliver his sister Abigail to his now former recruit and send him packing from the family altogether from there. If there was a silver lining to this, however, it was that, now out from under the shadow of his leader, the big man would finally get a chance to have a singles run. Unfortunately, though, this singles run would prove to be short-lived because after being apparently unimpressed with what he was seeing, Vince McMahon would choose to instead reunite Harper with his old teammate Eric Rowan in April of that year, as they from there went on to form the Bludgeon Brothers. Yes, with the boss having a notoriously short attention span when it came to pushing people at this point, there just wasn't enough time for Luke Harper to establish himself before he was returned to the tag team division. Still, it could have been worse. He could have just been saddled with the Mighty Mouse gimmick Adrian Neville was given when he first joined the WWE main roster in January of 2015. And the reason we say this one is bad is because, despite it marking the point where Neville would get a short-lived push, it was a gimmick which was always going to act as an albatross around his neck on account of how cheesy it was. Seriously, to see the Englishman come out there each and every week wearing a cape and trying to portray himself as such a cartoon-esque character just didn't gel with the performer people had come to know and love during his time down in NXT, where he was their world champion. Still, he made the best he could of it at the time. And it wasn't as if Vince McMahon didn't see the whole gimmick as a positive, because during his early weeks on the roster, the man now known as AEW's Pac would get to shine in some great bouts against the likes of Seth Rollins, at one point even almost dethroning the then WWE champion. And even after this was done, Neville would still maintain a solid spot in the mid-card when, over the course of the summer, he'd get into a notable feud with Stardust, which saw him take part in a big celebrity tag team match at that year's SummerSlam with Arrow star Stephen Amell in his corner. Of course, as time went on though, he would begin being slotted into more of a mid-card role, as with him being only 5'8" in height, he just didn't fit into the narrow parameters of what Vince McMahon thought a star could be. But while his frustrations over this would eventually see him leave the company in 2017 and find much more success elsewhere, when it comes to another cruiserweight on the roster, Kalisto remained with WWE until 2021 and was hoping that he'd one day get another push like he did in 2015 when he won the United States title. Yes, back during the mid-2010s, after having spent the years prior working his way up the ranks of NXT and then the main roster tag team division, management decided that the high-flying luchador might have what it took to become the company's next big Latino star. And that was why, on the January 11th episode of Raw in 2015, he'd get a sudden push up the card when he defeated Alberto Del Rio to become the new US champion. From there then, things looked to be going well, at least for a while, because across the rest of the winter and into the spring, Kalisto would successfully defend his belt against all comers. Unfortunately for him though, the curse of being in WWE and having his height start with a 5 would come back to bite him when, by July of that year, he'd have lost his title and would have been moved over to SmackDown, where any momentum he'd built up was quickly snuffed out. Of course, it didn't help that it was somewhere around this time that he'd also shown his limited mic skills with an all-time bad Lucha Thing promo. But if the company really were determined to keep going with him at this point, they could have always given him a manager to act as a mouthpiece. After all, that's what they did with our next subject, because in 2016, after having spent a lengthy run in the tag team division as one half of the primetime players, Darren Young would finally get a singles push when he joined forces with Bob Backlund. And yes, this was Backlund in full mid-90s mode, playing his crazed old man character. So even if Young wasn't the best talker on the roster, he didn't have to worry about that, because Bob had it covered while he concentrated on delivering in-ring. However, Backlund's campaign to make Darren Young great again would all ultimately fail, as over the coming weeks, Young would gradually get lost in the mix of storylines on the show. Still, that wasn't to say that there weren't some bright spots to the whole thing, as during this period, Young would get to raise his stock by feuding with the likes of Alberto Del Rio and The Miz over the Intercontinental title. Even if this was the case though, by the time the summer came around, the general feeling of indifference towards the gimmick, combined with the fact that Vince McMahon had apparently gotten bored and moved on to someone else, meant that Darren Young would be returned to the tag team division when he reunited with Titus O'Neil. But at least he got to keep a regular role on TV for a while after his push came to an end, so it wasn't all that bad. After all, it could have been a situation like Dabba-Kato underwent in 2020, because following his brief flirtation with the upper card while he was a part of Raw Underground, he'd really have nowhere to go from there but down. Of course, at first glance, it's easy to see why Vince McMahon wanted to have this Polish former football player on his roster, because with him looming over everyone else at 6'9" and weighing 350 pounds, he certainly stood out from the crowd. That said, despite initially signing with WWE in 2016, it wouldn't be until 4 years later that he made his full-time main roster debut, with his only notable appearance prior to this being a spot in the Greatest Royal Rumble pay-per-view. And while for the most part, the easy way to debut a giant at this point would have been to have him shock the live audience by destroying a beloved fan favorite, the fact that the world was in shutdown and no fans were in attendance in the summer of 2020 meant that this method would have to be altered somewhat. So in trying to come up with something new then, the boss would fall upon the idea of Raw Underground, a segment which started appearing on the third hour of Raw throughout this period and which sold itself on having more of a Fight Club aesthetic. But while it would initially look like wrestlers with legit shoot skills such as Dolph Ziggler and Otis were going to be the main beneficiaries of this, it quickly became apparent that the real reason behind the gimmick was to get Dabba-Kato over as a killer. And this meant that as the weeks went on, he'd destroy everyone in his path, all up until the point he came up against Braun Strowman, that was, because here, on the September 21st episode of the Red Brand, his winning streak would come to a sharp end. Yes, in record time, WWE decided they weren't happy with the progress of the big man, and so, before he could ever actually make it into a formal WWE ring, his push would be scrapped and he'd be sent back to the drawing board without having had a single official match. And since then, he's found himself rebranded as Commander Aziz, the heavy of Apollo Crews. So at the very least, he does have a role in the company for the time being. And even if this is lower card purgatory, it's not always the worst place to be, as a jobber can always get an unexpected push if the stars align. And if you want evidence of this, just ask Barry Horowitz. That's right, in the mid-90s, there were two people battling it out for the spot of top enhancement talent on WWF TV, Steve Lombardi and Barry Horowitz. Of course, things would briefly change for the latter in 1995 though, as it was then they'd receive an unexpected push up the card for the first time in their career. But why had Vince McMahon chosen to suddenly push the jobber after all these years? Well, the reason for that was at this point in time, he was so light on stars, he was throwing everything he could at the wall in hopes that something would stick. And this saw Horowitz begin turning things around in July of that year when he scored a pinfall win over Skip of the Body Donnas. Following that, he'd rack up even more wins on subsequent episodes of Raw and Superstars, with this all leading to him getting a pay-per-view match at that August SummerSlam where he would score yet another victory over Skip. So at this point, you would have been forgiven for thinking the Florida native was going to start getting pushed further up the card. Unfortunately though, no matter how hard the company had hoped he might reach Intercontinental title level here, Horowitz was unable to compete with the impressive mid-card roster the company had at the time. So realizing this then, Vince McMahon would begin easing him back down the card, returning him to the enhancement talent status he had been in before, and formally closing the book on his brief push. Yes, sometimes pushes don't work out because the performer in question isn't quite ready for it. That said, this argument certainly couldn't be applied to our next entry today, because in the case of Evan Bourne, he's always been one of the best cruiserweights of his generation. But WWE were already well aware of this when they brought him up to the main roster in 2008, and that was exactly why they gave him a push right out of the gate at this point. But what did his push involve? Well, after getting a chance to establish himself on the ECW brand during his early months there, Bourne would get to have a pay-per-view encounter with then ECW champion Matt Hardy after fans voted him into the spot at October 26th, Cyber Sunday. So seeing how over he was getting, WWE officials would decide to move him over to Raw where, starting in June of 2009, he'd get to rub shoulders with major stars such as Randy Orton, with him here immediately creating a highlight moment by taking what was probably, at the time, the greatest RKO ever. Sadly though, things would start to falter at this point because with him being yet another example of someone who is pigeonholed as a cruiserweight, Vince McMahon would soon begin to lose interest in the high flyer, and before long, would have moved on to someone else. But while this would see him fall down the card from there, it wouldn't be all that bad, because he would get to form a tag team with Kofi Kingston named Air Boom that kept both men relevant and regularly on TV for a while. So So maybe the lesson to be learned here then is, if you're someone who's given a push that proves to be short-lived, you better try and find a spot for yourself somewhere else quickly, otherwise you're liable to disappear into obscurity. And if you do this, who knows? Your next opportunity could come along at any time, and maybe this time it won't be a mini push. Now maybe it'll finally be the big one instead. Everyone has their favorite feuds, whether this be Austin versus The Rock, Dusty versus Flair, or countless others. And maybe it's the sheer volume of classic rivalries which has led to a select few falling under the radar and not getting the full credit they deserve. But what are the most underrated rivalries in wrestling history? Well, that's exactly what we are going to be looking at today. And where better to start than with one of the most underrated of them all, and that's Christian and Randy Orton's feud in 2011. Yes, it was after Edge was forced into early retirement in 2011 that fans got the silver lining of seeing his real-life best friend Christian rise to the top of the card for the first time in WWE when he won the vacant World Heavyweight title that the rated R superstar had left behind. Of course, this victory would prove to be short-lived though, as only days after snagging in a ladder match against Alberto Del Rio at May 1st, 2011's Extreme Rules, the current AEW star would drop it right back to Randy Orton in unceremonious fashion. And so began one of the best feuds of either man's career then, as now with fans fully behind him, Christian was able to get a rematch at the following month's Over the Limit pay-per-view. But when he lost this too, he decided to turn on both the Viper and all the people in attendance when he fell to the dark side. And that led to an even better third bout at June's Capital Punishment where, after feeling like he was cheated out of the title once more when the referee failed to notice his foot under the rope during the closing pinfall, the Toronto native fell even further into the depths of despair. How would he recover from this? Well, by securing a fourth match, where the rules would be that if Orton was disqualified, he'd lose his title, something which allowed Christian to get both the win and the title when he spat in the Viper's face during it and caused him to see red. Still, that wouldn't be the end of the story though, because at both SummerSlam and a subsequent episode of SmackDown, the two finally had their blow-off, with the last one coming inside of a steel cage and seeing Randy end up the ultimate victor, finally putting an end to his rival, as well as capping off what could be remembered as a career high point for each. That said, this isn't the only underrated Randy Orton feud which deserved to be remembered a lot more than it is. No, there was another which came in 2019, and it involved him dredging up a ghost from the past in Kofi Kingston. What were the ghosts he was pulling up here? Well, back in 2009, the pair had undergone their initial program, with this one being cut short when Kofi apparently botched the finish of one of their bouts and caused Randy to not hit the RKO when he wanted to. That's right, you all remember this one? It was the time Orton audibly screamed at his opponent on live TV, calling him stupid. And after that then, he reportedly spoke to higher-ups backstage and got any push that was in the cards for the Ghanaian-born star scrapped, meaning he wouldn't fully get his due until a decade later when Kofi Mania took hold and he ended up beating Daniel Bryan for the WWE title at WrestleMania 35. Obviously then, once Kingston reached the mountaintop and was looking for big-time challengers, the Viper became an obvious choice on account of their past history. Thankfully for the New Day member though, he didn't have to worry about his opponent being unprofessional this time around, as Randy had done a lot of growing up during the prior decade and was now only too happy to put his rival over strong once the two met at SummerSlam 2019. Not that they didn't get into it on the mic before this, however, with such moments allowing them to tie things back to that past program and give an added sense of reality to the whole thing. Really, the only thing negative we would have to say about the feud is that it didn't go on for longer. But unfortunately, Kofi would end up getting squashed by Brock Lesnar on an episode of SmackDown, ending his title reign in the lamest way possible. Yes, it's easy to mock much of WWE's booking during this time period, but that's not to say that there weren't bright spots, such as the Kingston-Orton feud we just mentioned. And another great underrated feud which came earlier in the decade also qualifies as a bright spot too, as this was the one which pitted Jeff Hardy against CM Punk. Now, CM Punk has had a lot of great programs over the years, such as his beefs with John Cena, Samoa Joe, and Chris Jericho. But while all of these have gotten a lot of attention, not a lot of attention has been given to the time he started a rivalry with the charismatic Enigma in 2009. What made this one so great? Well, it played off of the fact that both men appeared to be polar opposites of one another, with Punk being notoriously straight edge and Hardy being a recovering addict. Of course, this led to a lot of heated promo segments between the two then, once the rivalry fully kicked off when Punk cashed in his Money in the Bank contract on Jeff at that year's Extreme Rules, with many of these segments getting a little too real for at least one of the performers involved, proving that time is indeed a flat circle. On this occasion, however, such hurt feelings didn't lead to backstage fights. No, things were able to get in the ring for long enough for the pair to have back-to-back great bouts at both Night of Champions and SummerSlam in July and August, respectively. Then, once that was over, and it was clear WWE wasn't big enough for both men, they had one last meeting, a loser leaves town steel cage match on an episode of SmackDown, with this one seeing Punk pick up the win and send Hardy packing from the company for the next 8 years. Really, if you wanted to call this one an all-time classic, we wouldn't have blamed you. And it's a story that AEW could have revisited again up until a few months ago when Punk left that company. After all, by that point, it appeared the real-life ill will the charismatic Enigma held towards his one-time opponent had gone, and that he was more than ready to do business with him. But alas, this never happened, just as our next great underrated feud will probably never get revisited again either at this point. Which one are we talking about here? Why, the one pitting The Rock against the Hurricane, of course. Sure, it might have been a relatively short feud, and one which took place entirely on Raw, but that doesn't make it any less great, as it saw the People's Champion prove he really wasn't afraid to give back to those lower down the card than him. Yes, it all began in February of 2003 during the lead-up to WrestleMania, when Shane Helms began appearing in a bunch of backstage segments with The Rock, usually irritating him to no end with his superhero antics. And all this led to the March 10th episode of The Red Brand where, in the midst of the build to Austin vs. Rock 3 on the grandest stage of them all, the Great One decided to settle his growing beef with the Hurricane so that it wouldn't be on his mind by the time the big night came. Of course, what he expected here then was an easy win, with him treating the whole thing like little more than a tune-up bout where he could get rid of a pesky annoyance. But that's not what happened in the end, because in one of the greatest upsets in memory, Shane Helms actually came out victorious in this one, albeit with a little help from the Rattlesnake. Yes, it wasn't a clean victory as it had originally been booked to be, but it was a win over arguably the biggest star in the entire industry nonetheless. And that single moment was enough to take this whole program from the level of being a fun aside to that of an undervalued classic. There's no doubt it's the highlight of the Hurricane's career, and it really should be remembered as a highlight of Dwayne Johnson's too, as it shows him in a great light, doing something he didn't have to do. But it wasn't the only underrated feud the People's Champion took part in, as a few years earlier in 1998, he was having another great one against Ken Shamrock. Why was this one so great? Well, because you could argue it was the moment that The Rock really reached that next level on the ladder, as it fully established him as a top-level heel and convincing Intercontinental Champion. It was also the program he was involved in when the company exploded in popularity around the time of WrestleMania 14, so it was probably what first introduced him to many fans. But it wasn't just the Great One who came out of it looking good. No, Shamrock did too, as at various points between it starting in the spring and ultimately ending in the autumn, the former UFC fighter came across like an absolute badass and the prototype for everything the likes of Brock Lesnar would later prove to be. Hell, at WrestleMania 14, he'd even beat The Rock, and would only walk away without the IC title after the referee was forced to reverse the decision on account of Shamrock's inability to control himself once he saw red. And of course, we'd be remiss if we didn't mention the fact that this was the program that gave us probably the sickest chair shot to the head of all time, even worse than the ones Rocky gave to Mankind the following year. Yes, of all the great feuds of the early Attitude Era, this one really should rank right up there with the best. The only reason it doesn't, as far as we can tell, is because The Rock went on to become such a big star and to have such memorable programs with the likes of Steve Austin, Triple H, and Mick Foley. It managed to get lost in the shuffle among these. So once you're finished watching this video, make sure to fire up the WWE Network and go back and watch what it had to offer, as you won't be disappointed with what you see. Just as you won't be disappointed if you go back and watch another underrated classic that was taking place in Extreme Championship Wrestling around the same time. That's right, it's time to talk about Rob Van Dam versus Jerry Lynn. Now, anyone who was around during the late 90s will know that while WWF and WCW were at constant war over who was going to be the biggest wrestling company in the world, the cool alternative promotion to watch was ECW. That's right, if the latter two were the stadium rock bands who could fill out an arena, then Paul Heyman's band of Renegades were the alternative that played the local bar on a Friday night. And this meant getting into them usually involved scouring the tape trading circuit if you wanted to see some of their shows, with these shows always having at least one highlight that grabbed people's attention. That said, of all the highlights on show there, arguably none were as influential when it came to bringing people on board as the bouts between RVD and Jerry Lynn. Why was that? Well, there was nothing else quite like them on the American wrestling scene at the time. So groundbreaking were they in terms of their high-flying theatrics and wild spots. It didn't matter if it was their first pay-per-view meeting at March 21st, 1999's Living Dangerously, their second bout at Hardcore Heaven 2 months later, or the final in their trilogy on ECW's weekly TNN show in September of the same year. Each one deserves to be checked out if you haven't seen them already. And if you have seen them, go back and watch them again and remind yourself why these two were absolutely killing it back at the turn of the millennium. Hell, we'd go so far as to say it was this series which first truly gave Van Dam the fuel he needed to turn into the star he would later become. And it's this same series which allowed Lynn to become so respected by his peers that he's still working as a road agent today for AEW. The only question left is, given the fact that RVD now makes occasional appearances down in Jacksonville, will we ever see it revisited for the modern day? Well, the answer to that is more than likely no, as it doesn't look like Jerry Lynn has any intention of lacing up his boots again at this point. But that doesn't mean that the memories of it can't continue to live on as more and more people rediscover it. Of course, while they're doing this, they should also be rediscovering a great turn of the millennium feud which was happening in WCW, and that's the one between the Macho Man and Diamond Dallas Page. That's right, another example of a legend giving back, as well in 1997 the Macho Man could have very easily coasted on his big money contract and chosen to put no one over, basically what Hulk Hogan was doing. He instead decided he wanted to take an up-and-coming star and make him by having a series of classics with him. And that's what led to the pay-per-view trilogy between Savage and DDP at April's Spring Stampede, June's The Great American Bash, and October's Halloween Havoc then, with each one proving to be better than the last. Sure, it didn't get as much written about it at the time, as WCW at this point was all about building the upcoming Sting vs. Hogan showdown. But with the benefit of hindsight, you could argue it was far more beneficial in the long run, as it made a true star out of Page and set him on the path towards becoming a world heavyweight champion just 2 years later. Hell, so connected would DDP remain with the Macho Man in spirit afterwards that when he finally won this belt during a fatal four-way bout between him, Hogan, Sting, and Ric Flair at April 11th, 1999's Spring Stampede, it would be Randy who was officiating things. And as such, it would be him who raised the champ's arm at the end as DDP held the belt around his waist, with this giving a nice sense of closure to the bitter rivalry the two had gone through prior. Really, it's the kind of storytelling WCW could have used more of during this time, instead of the never-ending story that was the NWO angle. Hell, if they'd done more things like it, then the company might still be around today, and we might be talking about DDP as one of their elder statesmen. But instead of that, the whole feud is seemingly destined to go down as a semi-forgotten one. And it's not the only semi-forgotten feud Randy Savage took part in which deserves more love. That said, for the other program in question, we have to venture back over to New York, as it was there in 1994 that the Macho Man said goodbye to his time in WWE by getting into the ring with Crush. Now we know this one isn't an obvious choice for an underrated feud, but hear us out, because we think there's actually a lot to be said about it. Sure, it wasn't the rivalry with Shawn Michaels that the former two-time WWF champion wanted to have upon leaving the commentary booth and returning to the ring, but it was good in its own way. Hell, if nothing else, it represented Savage's attempts to use his star power to get another younger performer over, someone who at that point was still a potential future face of the company in Vince McMahon's eyes. And so that's why the legend gave it everything he had when the two met in the ring at WrestleMania 10 in a Falls Count Anywhere match that, while it wasn't exactly Omega Ospreay in terms of in-ring quality, at least it did the job of making Crush seem like he had the potential to be a player. And as if that wasn't enough reason to remember this one more fondly, it should also stay fresh in fans' minds that it was the real last on-screen beef the Macho Man had during his time in New York, as later that year, he'd leave WWF and never return. Of course, the reasons behind this are still somewhat of a mystery today. Whatever the truth, his battles with Crush represented the final opportunity for Savage to do his thing in a WWF ring, and for that reason alone, it shouldn't go forgotten. No, even if it was short-lived and didn't end up leading Crush to becoming the star some hoped he might be, it was still an underrated feud regardless for the reasons we've mentioned. So go back and check it out as well when you get the chance, as their showdown at WrestleMania 10 is worth a watch if nothing else. And once you're done with that, skip forward a few years to 2005, as that was when one of the greatest and most undervalued women's feuds in WWE history took place. Which one are we talking about this time? Why, what else but Trish Stratus versus Mickie James? Yes, in an era where women's wrestling wasn't anywhere near as high a level as it is in today's WWE, there were a few bright lights trying to keep things alive. And alongside Lita, arguably the brightest of these were Trish Stratus and Mickie James. Why was that? Well, because despite coming into the company as an untrained wrestler in 2000, Trish had quickly shown herself to be someone dedicated to learning her craft by becoming a legitimately good in-ring performer. And when it came to Mickie James, well, she was always great. Hell, you could argue that from an in-ring perspective, she was the best North American women's wrestler of her generation. So when she joined WWE in 2005 then, and instantly made a name for herself as the psychotic stan of Stratus, it created instant gold. That's right, over the months which followed, we'd all be treated to some great segments where Mickie got increasingly too close to her hero for her comfort, with this eventually causing the Toronto native to reject her superfan outright as it was all getting a bit much for her. And once that happened, James showed her true colors at last when she fully turned heel on Trish, with all this directing things towards a one-on-one bout between the pair at WrestleMania 22 in April. Of course, it should come as no surprise then that what followed was probably the greatest women's bout ever seen on the grandest stage of them all at that point in time, as over the course of 9 minutes, the two had an outright war, which eventually saw the heel come out the winner and new champion. Not that this would be the end of things though. No, far from it, because as a means of revenge, Trish would be able to get her win back at the following month's Backlash, even if this was only via disqualification, meaning she never actually won the title back. But whether she was the champion or not mattered little at this point. Rather, what was important was the job both her and Mickie had done in elevating the division above the level of the gimmicks matches which were the norm at the time. Hell, you could put this one on current day TV alongside the likes of Becky Lynch versus Charlotte Flair or Bianca Belair versus Io Sky, and it wouldn't look out of place, with this being a testament to just how ahead of its time it was in terms of bringing good women's wrestling to WWE. But let's move away from the women's division for a moment and back over to the men's, as it's there we find our next hugely underrated feud. And that's the one which occurred in 2011 when Cody Rhodes went to war with Rey Mysterio. Why has this one gone so under the radar in the years since? We're not entirely sure if we're being honest, as it was great from start to finish, a true beacon of hope amongst the deadlands that were the end of the 2000s, beginning of 2010's WWE. Basically, it all started when, in the lead up to the 2011 Royal Rumble during a bout between the two, Mysterio accidentally broke Rhodes' nose, causing the American Nightmare to begin losing his mind as he feared his good looks were now gone forever. So obsessed would he become with hiding what he believed to be his horrific visage from fans after that, in fact, he'd take to wearing a mask. Of course, the fact that this mask was clear plastic and so everyone could see his face anyway only added to what made this one so awesome. But that was just the icing on the cake at the end of the day, as the real body of things occurred when the pair met inside the ring, with the first of these bouts happening at WrestleMania 27 a couple of months later. And that wouldn't be the only meeting they had in the ring either, as following Cody's victory here, a rematch was scheduled for the April 22nd edition of SmackDown, during which Rey got his win back. But by the time the night was over, he'd feel like the loser all over again, as once the bell rang and the American Nightmare realized he'd lost, he laid out his rival with a crossroads, then placed a paper bag over his head, with this all leading to a rubber match at Extreme Rules on May 1st, 2011, where the babyface finally ended things once and for all in victorious fashion. Yes, it was a great feud that ended right at its peak, and for that reason alone, like with every other example we've looked at today, it deserves to be remembered for the unappreciated classic it truly is. Usually in modern day WWE, if you want to make it to Raw or SmackDown, you first have to have a stopover in NXT. And this isn't just the case for rookies either. No, even more established performers like Shinsuke Nakamura and Kevin Owens have been required to spend some time in developmental too. But there are a few who have managed to bypass this for one reason or another, and those are the people we're going to be looking at right now. And where better to start than with AJ Styles. Yes, after it was announced in early 2016 that WWE had managed to snag away 4 big names from the New Japan roster, with those names being AJ Styles, Shinsuke Nakamura, and the Good Brothers duo of Carl Anderson and Doc Gallows, there was immediate questions as to where and when these men would first show up on WWE TV. But while in the case of one of them, that initial stop would be NXT, for AJ, he was able to skip this entirely by debuting at that year's Royal Rumble to a rapturous ovation. Why had AJ gone straight to the main roster? Well, while you could argue about who was better, him or Nakamura, Styles was already somewhat established to an American audience and an American way of wrestling on account of his time working for TNA. And so it was felt there was no need to waste time with him down in developmental then, considering the hefty paycheck he was receiving. Of course, that turned out to be a great idea in the end, because after showing up that night in Orlando and making a quick impact, The phenomenal one was able to prove any of the doubters who didn't believe he'd be able to get over with Vince McMahon wrong when come the summer, he'd be entering into an iconic feud with John Cena, and come the autumn, he'd be beating Dean Ambrose to win the WWE title for the first time. That's right, this was a meteoric rise to the top for Styles, and one which proved that the Fed were right in their decision to not bother having him go down to NXT first, as that would have only delayed his success unnecessarily. After all, given he was already a two-time IWGP World Champion, three-time NWA World Champion, and two-time TNA World Champion at this point, what else was there for him to learn? And as the years have gone on, AJ has only further proven how good he is by having continued success well into his 40s. But not everyone gets their big break in WWE at such a relatively old age. No, some do it right out of the box during their youth, as was the case with our next subject, Dominic Mysterio. And like with AJ Styles, Dominic Mysterio found his success in WWE without ever having to go to NXT. Yes, we know he did spend a brief period as that brand's North American champion in 2023, but that was less him being a member of the developmental show and more him visiting from Raw in order to give it a boost in ratings. No, the truth is Dirty Dom never spent a period learning his craft in the black and gold brand. Rather, he did all this on Monday nights. Why was that? Well, you could argue that during his initial couple of years on the main roster, he might have benefited from going to learn there full time. The fact he was Rey Mysterio's son and was teaming up with his dad on a regular basis meant WWE had no intention of sequestering him away on NXT. No, they wanted to let the father-son duo shine bright on the biggest stage possible. And while this did cause some early growing pains for Dominic, in the end it worked out okay for him, because after turning heel and joining the Judgment Day in the summer of 2022, he'd unlock a whole new side to himself, one which was all of a sudden one of the most over heels in the entire industry. So obviously as it stands today then, there's no need for him to ever go down to the developmental for the long term, as he's already achieved something few people ever do, actually getting over in a very real way. Yes, just listen to the reactions he gets every time he comes out of the curtain for an appearance on Monday nights. And with Dom being such a success in that regard, it's caused WWE to try the same thing with others afterwards, with one of the most notable examples of this being Jade Cargill. Yes, Jade Cargill did get a lot of TV experience working for AEW prior to signing with the Fed in 2023. Hell, it was there that she became the former company's inaugural TBS champion, a title she held for 508 days. That said, even her biggest fans would have to admit she was pretty green in the ring at this point, with her still very much learning on the job. So why didn't WWE decide to send her to NXT first when she joined their roster? Well, like with AJ Styles, it seems it may have been about the big contract she had signed. That's right, with Triple H investing so much in her financially, he didn't choose to hide Jade away on the developmental show where less eyeballs would be watching her. No, he wanted to bring her right up to Raw and SmackDown, and there, give her a chance to sink or swim. Not that she'd be going right into the deep end herself, though. No, rather than push the Florida native as a singles act right away, the game would give Cargill the best of both worlds by having her appear on the main roster, albeit mostly in tag team matches, meaning she could work matches without being too exposed, all while she was learning from her tag partner Bianca Belair. And this has worked out great for her thus far because as it stands today, she's already won gold in WWE in the form of the women's tag team titles. And even though the team have since lost those titles, we are sure there are many more belts she'll win in the future, whether that be the Women's World title, WWE Women's title, or both. What we don't expect to see her win are the NXT Women's or Women's North American titles though. No, these will probably be out of her reach forever, as at this point, there's no reason for her to ever go down to NXT, save for maybe a cameo appearance like Becky Lynch or Charlotte Flair have done in the past. But let's move away from the women and back towards the men again for a moment, as it's there we find our next subject, not just one, but two performers who have recently followed in Jade Cargill's footsteps by bypassing NXT entirely and going straight to the main roster. Who are we talking about here? Why, Tonga Loa and Tama Tonga, of course. Now, fans of New Japan will no doubt have been familiar with Tama Tonga and Tonga Loa for some time, as it was there they teamed up as the Gorillas of Destiny, a key part of the Bullet Club over the years. Come 2024, though, their time out east would come to an end, as with WWE constantly looking to add more Polynesian wrestlers to the roster so as to continue on with the Bloodline story, they'd be snapped up to a big money contract. And because they were so tied to the Bloodline, given the fact that their father is Haku, scariest man ever and close associate of the NOIE family, there was no way they were ever going to NXT first. No, that would have made no sense from a storyline perspective, as, in storyline, the only reason they'd ever been brought into the company at all was because Solo Sikoa, supposed new leader of the Bloodline, had called them in to act as his new heavies. So rather than go to school, it was straight off to SmackDown, where they'd make a quick impact, helping to breathe some new life into the Bloodline as fans awaited the inevitable return of Roman Reigns and the Civil War storyline, which was sure to follow. Will the GOD be able to win any gold during this period on the Blue brand? It's entirely possible we'll see them win the tag team titles at some point. Of course, that tag team success almost certainly won't happen on NXT as well, as neither have ever set foot there. Well, kind of, because years ago, before he was Bullet Club for life, Tonga Loa had briefly worked for the Fed as Camacho, and during that time he made a few appearances for an early incarnation of the Black and Gold brand. That said, we're inclined to not count this one, as the character he was playing then was so different to the character he's playing now, it almost feels like a new person entirely. And Tonga Loa isn't the only person we're going to be talking about today who did technically appear on NXT before they made it to the main roster, because the exact same thing could be said about our next subject, Piper Niven. Yes, Niven first appeared on the main roster under the moniker of Dewdrop, backup heavy to Eva Marie. And before this, the Scottish-born star was never a part of the US version of the developmental brand, only on NXT UK. And after a short run under the Dewdrop moniker then, she was able to drop this gimmick and return to just being plain old Piper Niven again. With it being under her original moniker, she's been able to find added success, most notably by becoming a one-time women's tag team champion and the person who got to challenge Bayley for the WWE Women's Championship in her home country of Scotland at the recent Clash at the Castle show. Where will the future take her from here? It's entirely possible she eventually wins that WWE Women's title, or if not that, then the Women's World title. After all, as her time in Stardom showed, she's certainly capable of winning singles gold. And if she does do this, she'll be able to prove that you can find such success on the WWE main roster without ever having to once step foot inside of an NXT ring, well, at least in the US version of NXT. But then our next subject has already proven you can be a successful woman in WWE without having to go down to NXT first, as she's none other than Ronda Rousey. Now, the reason Ronda Rousey never went to NXT before going up to the main roster when she signed on the dotted line in 2018 was due to her enormous star power. After all, at this point in time, there was probably no more famous female athlete in the world outside of maybe the Williams sisters. So considering how big of a get she was for WWE then, and how much money she was making, it made no sense for her first matches to take place on the developmental brand. No, what she was about to do demanded the largest stage possible, and that stage would turn out to be WrestleMania. Yes, rather than starting in the small leagues, Rousey started out big on the grandest stage of them all. And while some might have scoffed at this initially, she was able to put on a great performance that night, and several more great performances as the months went on. But then why wouldn't she? After all, this was no woman who was inexperienced in combat sports, simulated or otherwise. No, this was the former UFC Women's Bantamweight Champion and one of the biggest draws in all of mixed martial arts. So it really should have come as little surprise that she was able to take to the ring so well, and that she was able to do this without having to spend time in NXT first, as she was no rookie when it came to grappling. Sure, as the time went on and her second run ended up being less successful than her first, some began to argue that maybe she should have gone down to the Black and Gold brand for a while first, but that's all stuff you can only say with hindsight, because at the time, no one was asking for Ronda to be taken off Raw and hidden away on Wednesday nights. And she's not the only outside celebrity who came in this way, because the same thing happened when our next subject made his own debut in 2021. Who are we talking about this time? Who else but Logan Paul? Yes, while Logan Paul is disliked by many fans, one thing you can't take away from him is that he's taken to the ring very quickly. And he's done all this without ever once having to go down to NXT. Seriously, despite only having 8 singles matches to his name, the YouTube star has already been able to hang in main event bouts with some of the best out there. And he's never looked out of his depth in doing so. Could he have benefited from going to NXT first? Maybe. But then probably not if we're being honest, because there was no need for this to happen. No, ever since his first bout, a tag team match pitting him and The Miz against the Mysterios at WrestleMania 38, it's been evident that Logan Paul was going to be fine working in a main roster ring. And again, like with others we've discussed today, given how much money he's earning and how big of a star he already is, putting him on anything other than Raw or SmackDown feels like a waste at this point. Sure, he could do a Dominic Mysterio and make a cameo appearance on 2.0 at some point, maybe even there defending his United States title against someone like a Trick Williams or a Wes Lee. But if this happened, it would just be that, a cameo. And the reason for this is because the money continues to be in having him show up on either Monday or Friday nights instead, as that's where the biggest audience is going to see him do his thing. But let's move away from outside celebrities and back to longtime wrestlers again. As it's here, we find our next subject, someone who also managed to bypass NXT when he signed with the company in 2013, Braun Strowman. Yes, well, Braun did technically appear on a few NXT live events in 2014, he never actually appeared on NXT television. So because of that then, we are counting him as someone who went straight to the main roster, as if you weren't one of those few people living in Florida who got the chance to see the Monster Among Men in a black and gold ring, you would have never known he was there at all. Did he miss out by not spending some time in developmental before heading up to Raw and SmackDown in 2015? Not really, because while he was very clearly green at this point, his limitations were able to be hidden by having him play the role of the muscle for the Wyatt family, someone who only needed to get physically involved once or twice a night. And once his time with the Wyatts came to an end then, he was good enough to go solo, with this being a role he'd get every opportunity to succeed in on account of his size. Yes, you could argue it would have still been better for the North Carolinian to spend some time in the developmental brand before heading up to the big leagues, as there, he could have honed his craft and better learned some of the fundamentals before being put in front of a worldwide audience. But this is not a guy anyone expects to be a technical wizard in the ring after all. No, he's a throwback to a very 80s WWF style of character, one who throws hands rather than submission maneuvers, and who has gotten over due to his strong presence. And presence was not something he needed time in NXT to learn because, as the great sage Enzo Amore once said, you can't teach that when it comes to being big and imposing. But of course, Braun Strowman isn't the only big guy on the current WWE roster who managed to skip NXT entirely, as the exact same thing happened with our next subject, Omos. That's right, while sending Omos down to the developmental brand when he first joined WWE in 2019 might have seemed like an obvious choice, especially as he had no prior experience as a wrestler, in the end, WWE chose to go in a different direction with him and instead rocket the 7'3" Nigerian up to Raw. But then we suppose it wasn't like he had no sports experience, as he was already a somewhat successful college basketball player prior to this. And with him being 7'3", there was no way Vince McMahon was going to wait around for him to spruce up his skills before he put him on TV. No, he wanted Omos on Monday nights right away. And that would ultimately happen on June 15th, 2020, when he made his first appearance as part of Akira Tozawa's Ninja faction. Yes, WWE during the latter days of Vince McMahon's reign was quite a place. And it would only get more bizarre from there, as the big man's next appearance would be on the infamous Raw Underground. Luckily though, things would get better for him after this because once Raw Underground came to a timely end, Omos would find himself under the learning tree of a new partner in AJ Styles. And it was with Styles by his side that the Lagos-born star was able to become a Raw Tag Team Champion. What happened after that? Well, not a lot. In fact, as it stands today, he's rarely seen on WWE TV anymore. Not that this means he's done forever though. Who knows? He could make a comeback any day now. In fact, he might even end up being one of the few people who starts out on the main roster and ends up going to NXT afterwards, as he could certainly find more than a few people to mix it up with down there. One person he won't be mixing it up with is our next subject though, because despite him skipping developmental entirely in 2017, Mike Kanellis no longer works in WWE. No, these days he can be found in either AEW or its sister promotion Ring of Honor, where he's currently both an ROH Tag Team Champion alongside Matt Taven and a member of Adam Cole's Undisputed Kingdom stable. Prior to that though, he served a spell in the Fed between 2017 and 2020. Not that any of this run would be spent in NXT, however. No, for some reason WWE chose to forego this with both Mike and his wife Maria Kanellis at this point and have them instead just head straight up to the main roster. Why did they make such a decision? That's hard to say. It's not as if the current Ring of Honor Tag Team Champion was an outside star on the level of a Ronda Rousey or a Logan Paul. But then he was already a very accomplished wrestler, so maybe Vince McMahon felt there was no need to send him down to school for a while first. Unfortunately for everyone involved though, Mike Kanellis never really managed to get going on the WWE main roster. And whenever he was on TV, it was usually on a D show like 205 Live, that or as part of a nothing 24/7 title segment. So perhaps this is one of those situations where the Massachusetts native would have fared better if he had actually gone to NXT then, as at least there, he would have been given a better chance of showing what he could do. But in the end, things didn't work out that way, and come 2020, both Bennett and Kanellis would be gone from WWE as part of a mass wave of releases. That said, for as sad as this was, at least one of his 205 Live co-workers has managed to keep his job all the way up until the present day, and in the case of Cedric Alexander, he also managed to do this without ever once going down to NXT. Sure, you could argue that being stuck away on the purgatory that was 205 Live was worse than being in developmental, as, while there was always good wrestling on the former show, it was never a popular show amongst most fans. And at least with NXT, there was a dedicated base of viewers who were following it on a week-to-week basis. But that wasn't the direction WWE saw for Cedric Alexander when they signed him in 2016. No, with this being the point they were trying to get their new Cruiserweight title off the ground following the success of the Cruiserweight Classic, the North Carolinians' real value was seen on this new show, designed to show off the best the smaller, high-flying guys had to offer. How would such a path work out for Cedric? Pretty well, as during this time he'd become a Cruiserweight champion. And once his time in 205 Live came to a close, he'd move up to Raw full-time, and there become a member of the hugely underrated The Hurt Business, alongside Bobby Lashley, MVP, and Shelton Benjamin, with him even becoming a Raw Tag Team Champion with Benjamin at one point. So in the end, not going to NXT didn't hold back Cedric Alexander one bit. No, if anything, it only allowed him to thrive and find main roster success faster than he would have otherwise. And he continues to compete in WWE today, now as a member of the SmackDown roster, as the new tag team partner of Ashanti, the Adonis.